Tonight, we're going to talk about what life was really like for ancient farmers in Mesopotamia. Not the kings or the priests or the warriors, just the regular people who worked the land every day. We'll take a slow, quiet walk through the struggles they faced, the hard work they did, and the world they lived in. So, before you get comfortable, subscribe to the channel and like the video and comment down where are you watching from and at what time. So if you're ready to settle in, close your eyes, and let your mind drift back in time, we'll begin. It's easy to romanticize the past, especially when we think about early farming civilizations like ancient Mesopotamia. There's something kind of peaceful about imagining wide, flat fields stretching out under a hazy sky. Maybe there's a gentle breeze, and maybe the sun is rising over the land between the rivers, casting soft gold across the soil. It sounds calm. But that image, it leaves out the reality of what life was actually like for the people who worked that land. Especially the farmers. Because for the average farmer in ancient Mesopotamia, life wasn't a peaceful stroll through barley fields. It was a daily grind. A back-breaking routine. It was long hours of dirty, difficult, never-ending work, from the moment the sky began to lighten in the morning all the way until the sun disappeared beyond the horizon. The thing is, there were no clocks. No shifts. No weekends. Farmers woke up with the sun, or even before it, and started working almost immediately. Sometimes, they were out in the fields while the sky was still dim, not even fully lit. There wasn't time to ease into the day. You had to get to it. You had to feed the animals, check the irrigation channels, haul water, and begin preparing the ground, all before the real labor even started. The kind of labor that leaves your hands raw and your back sore. And the days didn't end at noon, or at dinner time. They ended when the sun was completely gone, and you couldn't see your hands in front of you anymore. Imagine standing in the hot sun with no shade for hours, dragging a heavy wooden plow across dry, stubborn ground. That wasn't a rare task, that was most days. And it wasn't just one person doing it. Farming took a whole family. Wives, children, even the elderly, everyone had a job, because there was no other option. If someone in the family wasn't working, something wasn't getting done. That meant you might go hungry later. There were no tractors, of course. No machines to help dig or harvest. Just your own two hands and maybe an animal or two if you were lucky. If you had an ox, that helped a little, but you still had to guide it. You had to walk behind it for hours, trying to keep it on track, trying not to let it veer off and ruin a row. You might be pushing a primitive wooden plow behind it, one that bounced and cracked and got stuck every few feet. And if you didn't have an animal, you were the animal. You had to pull the plow yourself. Every step of farming was physical. You didn't just plant seeds by sprinkling them around. You had to dig little holes by hand or with a crude tool, place each seed, cover it, and make sure it was spaced correctly. And you did that over and over and over again, not for a few feet, but for acres. Kneeling down, standing up, bending over again. The repetition wore on your joints. Your knees hurt. Your back ached. Your arms went numb. But you kept going, because you had to. There weren't meals at regular times. Sometimes you ate standing up in the field. Sometimes you didn't eat at all until late at night. There wasn't time to stop for a long lunch or go home and rest. The sun didn't stop moving, and neither did the work. Even when you weren't in the fields, there was more to do. You had to repair tools. You had to tend to animals. You had to patch your home or grind grain or check the water supply. There was always something. Always. And then there were the seasons. The summer was brutal, dry, dusty, and unbearably hot. The sun wasn't just warm, it burned. Your skin cracked. You got blisters on your hands from holding tools too long. Sweat didn't make it cooler. It just soaked your clothes and stung your eyes. There was no shade in most places, no real cover from the elements. And even if there was, you weren't allowed to stop working just because the weather was miserable. During planting season, everything had to be done quickly. Seeds had to be in the ground before the conditions changed. There was a tight window. And during harvest, that might have been the worst part. That was when you worked until your muscles gave out. You had to move fast, gathering everything while it was still good, while the weather still held. You might sleep in the field. You might not sleep at all. And you couldn't take a break. Not even for a day. Because if you waited, the wind could knock over your crop. Or bugs might get to it. Or mold. Or animals. Or worse, people. But more on that later. Even when a farmer was exhausted, even when their body begged them to stop, they had to keep going. Because stopping meant less food. And less food meant hunger. And hunger meant trouble. Now picture doing this not for a week. Not for a season. But for your entire life. From childhood to old age. Generation after generation. No promotion. No change of career. Just the same fields. The same aching joints. The same sun. Every single day. That was the reality of being a farmer in ancient Mesopotamia. No vacation. No rest days. Just sunup to sundown, every day, forever. And even after all that work, even if you managed to keep up with everything, there was still a huge risk that nature would undo it all in a blink. Which brings us to the second reason why farming in Mesopotamia really, truly sucked. You could be the hardest working person in your village. You could wake up before the sun every single day. You could plant your crops with perfect care, maintain the soil, guard your irrigation channels, and still, watch everything disappear in a single night. Because in ancient Mesopotamia, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers were unpredictable. They were the source of life and destruction at the same time. These rivers didn't follow anyone's schedule. They didn't flood politely, or with warning. They didn't ask permission. Sometimes the floodwaters rose slowly. Other times, they rushed in all at once, churning through the fields like a wild animal. And when the floods came, they didn't just bring water. They brought mud, debris, and chaos. They buried seeds. They ripped up newly sprouted plants. They drowned growing grain and washed away the topsoil. Everything you had spent months working toward could be gone by morning. And there was nothing you could do to stop it. There weren't flood warnings. There weren't protective walls that always worked. You just had to hope that the river behaved itself this year. And sometimes, it didn't. Worse yet, you couldn't predict when or where the flooding would happen. One part of the river might overflow while another stayed dry. One village might get lucky while the next was ruined. And if you lived downstream, you were at the mercy of every single thing that happened upstream: rainfall, snowmelt, or even someone else messing with the irrigation system. You had no control. And when those waters came pouring in, they didn't just ruin your crops. They could destroy your home, drown your animals, ruin your stored supplies. They turned carefully plowed fields into soggy messes. They made the land unusable for weeks, sometimes months. And by the time it dried, it might be too late to plant again. The season would be gone. Think about that. Months of work, undone in a few hours. All that labor, all that planning, just washed away. And no one paid you back. The king didn't refund your seed. The officials didn't replace your animals. If your farm flooded, that was your problem. You still had to pay taxes. You still had to hand over grain to the authorities. You still had to find food for your family. The river didn't care. And neither did the people in power. Some years, you might be lucky. The river might bring rich silt and help your crops grow stronger. But you could never count on it. The water giveth, and the water taketh away. This unpredictability made farming a gamble. Every season was a risk. You could do everything right and still lose everything. And you couldn't skip a year and try again later. You either planted and hoped for the best, or you went hungry. And if that wasn't bad enough, sometimes, right after the floods, things got even worse. After the floods had swept through the fields, leaving behind a thick layer of mud and debris, there was little time for relief or rest for the farmers of ancient Mesopotamia. While the water might have initially seemed like a blessing, nourishing the soil and replenishing nutrients, the devastation it caused was often followed by an even crueler fate: drought. This cruel cycle of extremes was a relentless enemy that made farming a constant gamble with nature. The rains and floods could drown the crops, washing away months of hard work and hope, but when the floods receded, the sun would often turn fierce and unforgiving, baking the land dry. The soil, once heavy with water, would harden and crack under the heat, making it impossible for the young shoots that had survived the flood to grow or thrive. Without water, these tender plants would wither quickly, and entire fields could be lost to the scorching dryness. For the farmers, this was heartbreaking. They had invested their sweat, time, and hope into each seed they planted, and to watch it all die from thirst was a kind of slow, painful defeat. The unpredictability of these floods and droughts was a constant source of anxiety and fear. Unlike today, where weather patterns can be forecasted and planned for, ancient Mesopotamian farmers lived with no such certainty. The mighty Tigris and Euphrates rivers could swell beyond their banks one year, drowning everything in their path, and then barely trickle the next, refusing to provide the life-giving water the crops desperately needed. It was not just a matter of bad luck but a brutal fact of life that shaped the very rhythm of farming. Families had to prepare for both extremes, though how to do so with limited technology and resources was a daily struggle. Many times, when the drought came after a flood, the damage was doubly catastrophic. The fields that had been ruined by waterlogged soil were then further destroyed by the relentless sun. The crops that somehow managed to cling to life were left vulnerable, often stunted and weak, unable to produce enough grain to feed the farmers' families or pay the taxes demanded by the rulers. In this cycle, there was no room for error or delay. Every moment counted because one missed day of watering or tending to the land could mean the difference between a harvest and starvation. The emotional toll on the farmers was immense. Imagine the crushing weight of seeing your fields drowning one week and then baking in the sun the next, powerless to stop either disaster. This constant threat shaped their entire existence, casting a shadow over their lives that never quite lifted. It's important to remember that these droughts did not just affect the plants but the whole community. With fewer crops to harvest, there was less food to share, and hunger would spread. Livestock, which the farmers depended on for plowing and food, would also suffer. Water became scarce not just for the fields but for people and animals alike. The struggle for survival during these dry spells was brutal, and many families faced the terrifying possibility that their hard work would be wasted, their food stores emptied, and their futures uncertain. This relentless cycle also impacted the social structure and economy of ancient Mesopotamia. When drought struck, farmers were often unable to meet the demands placed upon them by the ruling classes. The crops that survived might be barely enough for their own sustenance, let alone enough to pay taxes or support the city's needs. This could lead to debt, punishment, or worse, which added to the daily pressure farmers faced. Droughts also meant that food prices could skyrocket in towns and cities, causing unrest and hardship far beyond the fields. The farmers were trapped in a system where their very survival depended on forces far beyond their control. The whims of the rivers, the changing seasons, and the harshness of the sun, and they had to endure it all with little relief. The knowledge of these cycles was passed down through generations, woven into stories, prayers, and rituals meant to appease the gods and secure a better harvest. Farmers would pray for gentle rains and mercy from the skies, hoping to break the pattern of destruction that floods followed by droughts brought. Yet, despite their efforts, the unpredictability remained. This made farming in ancient Mesopotamia not just a job but a grueling test of endurance and resilience, where hope was fragile, and every season brought the looming possibility of disaster. In ancient Mesopotamia, the lifeblood of farming was water, and because the rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, were so unpredictable, farmers couldn't rely on rain alone. Instead, they had to create and maintain an intricate system of irrigation canals that carried water from the rivers to their fields. This was no small task. The work involved digging deep, wide canals to guide the water where it was needed, building embankments to keep the water flowing steadily, and constantly repairing the channels whenever they cracked or clogged. Without these canals, the parched land would have remained barren, and farming as they knew it would have been impossible. But the sheer amount of labor required was staggering. Digging these canals was back-breaking work. Imagine standing under the hot Mesopotamian sun, wielding simple tools made from wood or stone, scraping out earth day after day. The soil was often hard and dry, making it tough to dig through. Sometimes the farmers had to deal with thick clay that stuck to their tools or sand that kept blowing back into the trenches they'd just cleared. It wasn't just about digging either. The canals needed to be shaped carefully, angled precisely so that water could flow smoothly without flooding the fields or stagnating in one place. This required knowledge and skill passed down through generations, but it still meant hours of grueling physical labor. Maintaining these irrigation canals was a continuous battle. Over time, silt and debris would accumulate, blocking the water's path and threatening to cut off the supply to the crops. Farmers had to regularly clear the canals of mud, plants, and sometimes even animal carcasses that found their way into the waterways. This meant more hard labor, often in waterlogged and muddy conditions that made movement slow and difficult. The canals were vulnerable to damage from weather as well. Heavy rains could cause them to overflow or wash away parts of the embankments, while the scorching sun could dry out and crack the soil, causing leaks. The importance of the irrigation system meant that maintaining it wasn't just a job for individual farmers, but often a community effort. Entire villages had to come together to repair breaches in the canals or dig new branches to bring water to more fields. However, coordinating this was complicated. If a group failed to repair their section, or if some farmers used more than their share of water, tensions could rise. Water was a precious resource, and sharing it fairly was a constant challenge. Arguments and disputes over irrigation rights were common, and sometimes these conflicts escalated beyond simple disagreements. On top of that, the state or local rulers sometimes demanded that farmers contribute labor to large-scale canal projects. These weren't just small irrigation ditches but massive engineering works stretching for miles. The rulers saw irrigation as vital to the prosperity of their cities and empires, so they imposed corvée labor, forced work, on farmers. This took them away from their own fields for days or even weeks, adding to their already overwhelming workload. While the canals benefited everyone in the region, the burden of maintaining and expanding them often fell heavily on the farmers' shoulders. The canal systems themselves were prone to constant breakdowns. Floodwaters could tear through embankments, creating breaches that would flood fields or leave others dry. Repairing these breaches was urgent work because any delay could destroy an entire harvest. Farmers had to rush to pile mud, clay, and reeds back into the cracks and reinforce them with stones or wood. Sometimes, they built small dams or locks to control water flow, but these were also vulnerable and needed frequent fixing. Seasonal changes also complicated canal maintenance. In the dry season, water levels dropped, and farmers had to work extra hard to keep the canals clear so that what little water was left would reach the crops. During the wet season, the canals had to be reinforced to withstand the pressure of the swelling rivers. This cycle of repair and maintenance never ended, meaning there was very little downtime or rest for farmers when it came to water management. The physical toll of this work was immense. Digging, clearing, and repairing canals demanded strength, stamina, and resilience. Farmers often faced back pain, blisters, and exhaustion from long hours under the burning sun. The risk of injury was high, too, especially when working with primitive tools or unstable canal banks that could collapse. Yet, if they failed to keep the canals in good condition, their crops would suffer, which meant hunger, debt, or worse. It's also important to note that irrigation canals contributed to another set of problems. Because water stood in the fields for long periods, it created muddy, wet conditions perfect for breeding mosquitoes and spreading waterborne diseases. Standing water increased the risk of illnesses like malaria and other fevers that plagued farming communities, making life even harsher. Farmers had to weigh the necessity of irrigation against the health risks it brought. Another frustration was that canals could be sabotaged or mismanaged by others. Since many farmers shared the irrigation network, some would divert water to their own fields illegally or fail to repair their section, causing shortages downstream. These kinds of water thefts or neglect could ruin a whole season's work for others and lead to bitter disputes. Sometimes, local officials had to intervene to settle such conflicts, but justice wasn't always fair or timely. The irrigation system was a delicate balance between nature and human effort. It was both a miracle and a curse. Without it, farming would have been impossible in the dry Mesopotamian environment. With it, farmers faced endless toil, uncertainty, and conflict. They were trapped in a cycle where they had to constantly fight the earth itself just to survive. This constant labor shaped their lives, their communities, and their very identity. To maintain the canals, farmers often had to organize labor among family members, neighbors, and sometimes hire or barter for extra hands during the busiest repair times. Children and women were involved in lighter canal work, while men took on the heavier digging and rebuilding. This meant the whole family's daily rhythm was tied to the state of the irrigation system. If a canal broke during a critical growing season, It wasn't just one farmer affected but the entire village's food supply. What made this even harder was that the canals were ancient and often built over centuries, meaning repairs sometimes involved working on old, fragile structures. Farmers had to be careful to preserve the integrity of the system while making fixes, which required knowledge and skill few possessed. Mistakes could cause catastrophic failures, so learning how to manage canals was an essential but difficult part of being a farmer. Sometimes, in desperate times, farmers would try to dig their own private channels to get water to their fields, bypassing the official system. But this was risky and could lead to punishment or retaliation from neighbors or authorities. The water network was tightly controlled because it was vital to the whole region's survival. Any disruption could have ripple effects, making unauthorized digging a dangerous gamble. Even with all the effort, farmers had to accept that nature could still overpower their work. Sudden storms could fill canals beyond capacity, flooding fields and washing away topsoil. Droughts could dry up canals completely, leaving fields thirsty despite all the labor. This unpredictability made maintaining irrigation a constant struggle between human will and the forces of nature. The dependence on irrigation also meant farmers were tied to their land and the local water system. They couldn't just move if conditions got bad or if their canals failed repeatedly. Their livelihood, survival, and future generations were locked into these fragile networks of water and earth. This lack of mobility added another layer of hardship to farming in ancient Mesopotamia. Despite the hardships, the irrigation canals were also a symbol of the farmers' ingenuity and determination. They built complex systems from simple materials, transforming a harsh landscape into productive farmland. This achievement was the backbone of Mesopotamian civilization, supporting cities and empires for thousands of years. But for the farmers themselves, the work was exhausting, never-ending, and often thankless. Their hands shaped the earth and guided the water, yet their lives were marked by struggle and toil. In the end, the canals were both a source of life and a source of relentless labor. The farmers' connection to these waterways was intimate and constant, a daily reminder of their dependence on nature's mercy and their own tireless efforts. Without the canals, Mesopotamia would have remained a desert, but with them, farmers faced a lifetime of sweat, struggle, and uncertainty. In ancient Mesopotamia, after farmers poured their blood, sweat, and endless hours into growing their crops, nurturing seedlings, battling the elements, and maintaining irrigation, their struggles were far from over once harvest time came. Instead of enjoying the fruits of their hard work fully, a significant portion of their harvest was taken away by tax collectors. These taxes were a fixed obligation imposed by the ruling authorities, often the king or local governors, who viewed the farmer's yield as a key source of wealth and resources to support the state apparatus, the military, the priesthood, and the royal court. For farmers, this was a bitter reality. No matter how little their crops produced or how challenging the season had been, they were legally bound to surrender part of their harvest. The tax system was particularly harsh because the best parts of the harvest were usually taken. Tax collectors wanted grain that was ripe, dry, and clean, the highest quality, so they could store it, trade it, or redistribute it according to the needs of the empire. This meant farmers were often left with lower quality grain, smaller quantities, and less variety for their own consumption and for feeding their families and animals. The frustration of losing the choicest part of their crop was immense, especially since farming was their sole livelihood and the well-being of their households depended on every grain saved. Tax collectors were often officials or agents of the state, who traveled through villages during harvest season to assess and collect what was owed. Their presence was intimidating and stressful. Farmers had to carefully measure and present their crops, knowing that any underreporting could lead to punishment or accusations of fraud. The pressure to meet tax demands created an atmosphere of fear and anxiety during what should have been a time of relief and celebration after months of hard work. The taxation process itself was complicated. It involved official record-keeping on clay tablets by scribes who documented how much each farmer owed. Since most farmers were illiterate, they had to rely on these officials to record their payments accurately, which sometimes led to exploitation or errors that worked against them. Tax collectors had significant power, and corruption was not unheard of. Some collectors demanded extra from farmers or took bribes, worsening the economic burden on the farming families. For many farmers, paying taxes meant they had little left to sell or store for emergencies. This forced them to live season to season, vulnerable to any bad harvest or natural disaster. If a drought, flood, or pest destroyed crops, farmers still owed taxes based on previous year's yields or estimates, pushing them deeper into debt or poverty. This system kept them trapped in a cycle of subsistence with no financial cushion to fall back on. The tax burden also contributed to social inequality. While the ruling class and city elites benefited from the surplus grain collected, farmers remained poor laborers, unable to improve their lives significantly. The system reinforced a hierarchy where farmers worked tirelessly but had little control over the wealth their labor generated. It was a constant reminder that the land and its produce belonged, ultimately, to the king and his administrators, not to the people who toiled on it. In addition, these taxes were not limited to grain alone. Farmers might also have to pay in livestock, labor, or other goods. Some were required to provide workers for state projects or military service as a form of tax payment. This further drained their resources and time, taking them away from their fields when they were most needed. The multifaceted nature of taxation in Mesopotamia deepened the hardship farmers faced. The timing of tax collection was also crucial. Taxes had to be paid shortly after harvest, when farmers were most vulnerable. Crops were freshly gathered, and any losses or damages were fresh wounds. Paying taxes reduced the amount of food available for the winter months, when growing was impossible, forcing farmers to rely on what little they could hide or store. The stress of managing food shortages while fulfilling tax obligations added another layer of difficulty to their already precarious existence. Moreover, the tax system was rigid. Farmers had little room to negotiate or request relief during bad years. The state's need for steady revenue outweighed individual hardship. This rigidity meant that even in years of crop failure or natural calamities, farmers were expected to pay their dues or face severe consequences such as fines, confiscation of property, or even imprisonment. This inflexibility made farming a risky and often unrewarding profession. Because of these heavy taxes, many farmers resorted to borrowing grain or money to meet their obligations, plunging themselves into debt. Debts could spiral out of control, leading to loss of land, forced labor, or selling family members into slavery to pay what was owed. The tax system, while vital to the state, was a major factor in the cycle of poverty that plagued the farming class. The economic strain created by taxes also influenced the social fabric of rural Mesopotamia. Families lived in constant worry about their ability to produce enough to satisfy the tax collectors while feeding themselves. This pressure led to overcrowding as families squeezed into smaller living spaces, taking on extra labor to cover deficits, and sometimes abandoning farms for cities in search of less harsh livelihoods. For women and children, the tax burden indirectly affected their daily lives. Since a portion of the harvest was taken away, there was less food for the household, requiring everyone to work harder to supplement what was lost. Women often took on additional roles in food preparation, storage, and even assisting in the fields during peak seasons to help increase yields, while children contributed by tending animals or helping with irrigation. The entire family felt the weight of taxation. The psychological impact of tax collection was also significant. The farmers' relationship with their rulers was distant and often hostile. Tax collectors represented a constant reminder of their subservience and lack of control over their own lives and labor. This bred resentment and sometimes fear, as the consequences of failing to pay could be harsh and immediate. The pressure of taxation created a societal divide between the ruling elite who benefited from the surplus and the farmers who barely survived. In some instances, heavy taxation led to rebellion or flight. Historical records show that when taxes became unbearable, farmers sometimes abandoned their land or joined uprisings against local rulers. However, such resistance was dangerous and rarely successful, as rulers had armies and legal systems to enforce tax collection. For most, the fear of punishment kept them tied to the system, no matter how unfair it seemed. The tax collectors themselves lived lives of relative privilege compared to the farmers. They were often rewarded with portions of the grain they collected or given land and status in return for their service. This created a class of officials who depended on maintaining the system and enforcing its demands, sometimes at the expense of fairness or compassion. The gulf between tax collectors and farmers was wide and reinforced social hierarchies. While the tax system ensured the state's survival and funded monumental projects like temples, palaces, and irrigation networks, it came at a high cost to the farmers. They were the backbone of Mesopotamian civilization, but their contributions were exploited through heavy taxation. The relentless demand for grain and labor kept farmers poor, exhausted, and constantly anxious about their future. Despite these hardships, farmers continued their work year after year, understanding that their survival and the survival of their families depended on producing enough to meet tax obligations and still have something left for themselves. The tax system was an unyielding force in their lives, shaping their daily routines, social relations, and economic prospects. In the end, the portion of the harvest taken by tax collectors was more than just a loss of food. It represented the ongoing struggle between the needs of the state and the harsh realities faced by those who worked the land. Farmers sacrificed their best grain, their time, and their peace of mind, all while battling the unpredictable forces of nature and an unforgiving social order. This imbalance defined much of the hardship that made farming in ancient Mesopotamia a life filled with relentless struggle and few rewards. In the world of ancient Mesopotamian farmers, every day demanded exhausting physical labor, yet they had to perform this work using tools that were rudimentary by today's standards. Their farming implements were primarily made from stone, wood, and occasionally bone, materials that were readily available but inherently fragile and limited in function. Unlike the metal tools we rely on today, these early tools broke easily, wore down quickly, and had to be repaired or replaced frequently, making the work even more grueling and inefficient. The primary tools for planting, cultivating, and harvesting were simple handheld devices. Wooden digging sticks were used to break the soil, but they could splinter or wear out after repeated use in tough, clay-like earth. Stones were sometimes attached to wooden handles to create primitive hoes, but the stones could loosen or shatter under stress. Such fragility meant that farmers had to stop their work often to fix or remake tools, wasting precious time during critical planting or harvesting seasons. Because metalworking was either not yet developed or limited in early Mesopotamia, farmers could not benefit from the strength and durability of bronze or iron tools. This technological limitation meant that tools lacked sharpness, strength, and resilience. For example, sickles used for cutting grain were often made from flint or obsidian blades set into wooden handles. While effective, these blades dulled quickly and were brittle, prone to chipping or breaking after continuous use, forcing farmers to expend effort crafting replacements or sharpening them constantly. The constant breaking and wear of tools also increased the overall workload. Every time a tool broke, the farmer had to stop physical labor and either repair it or fashion a new one. This added an extra layer of difficulty to an already exhausting day. Crafting tools required skill and time, often diverting attention from farming itself. Those who lacked the knowledge or resources to make replacements had to borrow or trade, introducing dependency and vulnerability into their work lives. In addition to the limited durability, these tools were often basic in design, lacking the ergonomic features that would reduce fatigue or improve efficiency. Handles were rough, sometimes splintered, and not shaped to fit the hand comfortably. This meant farmers endured painful blisters, callus, and muscle strain from prolonged use. Without cushioning or thoughtful construction, even simple tasks like digging or cutting demanded intense effort. The lack of mechanization or animal-powered tools compounded these difficulties. For instance, ploughing was done primarily by hand or with the help of oxen pulling wooden ploughs. These ploughs were basic wooden frames with a sharp edge to cut into the soil, but they did not have the metal blades that modern ploughs have. As a result, breaking hard ground was slow and exhausting, limiting the area a farmer could till in a day. When wooden tools broke, farmers had to find suitable timber, which was not always easy in the often arid or deforested landscape of Mesopotamia. Transporting wood to the fields added labor, and sometimes the quality of available wood was poor, increasing the chance of tools breaking again. This cycle created a constant maintenance burden, with farmers balancing tool repair alongside their other daily demands. The fragility of stone and wooden tools also meant that farmers were vulnerable to seasonal changes. During dry periods, the earth could become rock-hard, making digging sticks or wooden hoes ineffective. Tools could snap or dull before a field was properly prepared. Conversely, in wetter seasons, wood could swell, crack, or rot, making tools unreliable. These environmental factors further exacerbated the instability of their equipment. Due to the constant need for new tools, farmers sometimes had to allocate part of their limited harvest or earnings to obtain raw materials or pay skilled craftsmen. This diverted resources away from food or family needs, further deepening their financial strain. The production and maintenance of tools were thus a hidden, yet persistent cost of farming life. Moreover, the tools lacked precision and power. For example, weeding was a painstaking process without sharp blades or hoes that could quickly clear large areas. Farmers had to remove weeds by hand or with blunt tools, a slow and frustrating task that consumed valuable time and energy. Similarly, harvesting grain required careful cutting with dull sickles, increasing the risk of injury or crop damage. The technological gap between these early tools and later innovations also meant that Mesopotamian farmers could not maximize their land's productivity. Limited tool efficiency translated to lower yields per unit of labor, meaning they had to spend longer hours working just to produce enough food. This inefficiency was a major reason why farming was such a grueling existence. The physical toll on farmers was enormous. Constant bending, digging, cutting, and carrying with inadequate tools resulted in chronic aches, injuries, and long-term wear on their bodies. There was no possibility of rest or ease. Every movement required more exertion than necessary, with tools that made their work harder rather than easier. Farmers also faced challenges in harvesting and processing crops with these primitive tools. Threshing grain, for example, involved beating stalks to separate grain from husks. Without specialized tools, this was done with flails, wooden sticks tied together, which, while effective, required repetitive and tiring motions. The poor quality of tools sometimes caused these implements to break mid-task, forcing farmers to improvise and lose precious time. Storage tools and containers were similarly basic, often made from woven reeds or crude pottery, which could crack or break, allowing pests to enter and damage the grain. The fragility of these implements added to the risk that farmers' hard-won crops could be lost even after harvest, intensifying the pressure to maintain their fields and tools in good condition. Furthermore, the lack of durable tools made it difficult to innovate or improve farming techniques. Without reliable implements, farmers were stuck with traditional, labor-intensive methods that limited their ability to expand production or experiment with new crops or planting patterns. This stagnation kept farming a physically punishing occupation with minimal rewards. The combination of primitive, breakable tools with demanding agricultural tasks made Mesopotamian farming a relentless struggle. Farmers had to wake early and work until sunset, constantly fighting against not only the land and climate but also their inadequate equipment. Each broken tool represented lost time, extra effort, and a step backward in their race to produce enough food. In a society that demanded high productivity for taxation and survival, the limitations of farming tools were a silent but powerful factor that shaped daily life. The frustration of working hard with tools that failed often, combined with the dangers of natural disasters and social pressures, made farming in ancient Mesopotamia one of the most difficult and unforgiving occupations imaginable. Despite these harsh realities, farmers persevered, passing down their skills and tools from generation to generation. Over time, gradual improvements in toolmaking did occur, but for most of Mesopotamian history, farmers lived with the constant challenge of fragile, breakable tools that made every day a battle of endurance and willpower. The image of the ancient Mesopotamian farmer is thus one of perseverance amid hardship, struggling not only with nature but also with the very tools designed to help them survive. Their work was heroic in its persistence, but marked by exhaustion and frustration, a testament to human resilience in the face of relentless difficulty. In ancient Mesopotamia, farmers relied heavily on animals to help with the demanding task of plowing their fields. Among these animals, oxen were the most common beasts of burden, chosen for their strength and endurance. However, working with oxen was far from easy. Despite their power, oxen were slow-moving, stubborn, and difficult to control, making the farming process both time-consuming and physically draining for the farmers. Unlike modern tractors or mechanized plows, the wooden plows pulled by oxen were simple and crude. These plows lacked metal blades and were basically wooden frames with a sharp edge carved or attached, designed to cut into the soil enough to turn it over and prepare it for planting. While oxen could pull these plows, the process was slow because the plows had to be pushed into hard soil by the animals and the farmer alike. This was especially true for the dense, clay-heavy earth typical of the Mesopotamian river valleys. Controlling an oxen team required significant skill and patience. Oxen were not naturally cooperative animals and often resisted commands. They moved at their own pace, which was slow and steady but could be interrupted by distractions such as noises, sudden movements, or other animals. Farmers had to use a combination of vocal commands, prodding sticks, and sometimes harsh treatment to get the animals to pull the plough straight and consistently across the fields. In many cases, the oxen would veer off course, dig their hooves into the ground, or even stop pulling altogether. This forced the farmer to constantly correct their direction, coax them forward, or sometimes even get down from the plough to physically guide or prod the animals. This disrupted the rhythm of the work and extended the time needed to prepare a field, adding to the overall exhaustion. Moreover, the slow pace of oxen meant that large fields took an entire day or more to plough. Farmers had limited daylight hours and could not afford to waste time, yet their pace was dictated by the oxen's behavior and endurance. This slow work pace often left fields only partially prepared, increasing the risk of poor crop yields. The process was also hard on the animals themselves. Oxen pulling heavy wooden ploughs through tough soil over long hours were subject to fatigue, injuries, and disease. There was no veterinary care as we know it today, so if an ox became sick or lame, it could no longer work effectively, forcing the farmer to slow down or stop farming altogether until the animal recovered or was replaced. Feeding and caring for oxen also added to the burden of the farming family. These animals needed substantial amounts of food and water, resources that were not always easy to come by, especially during droughts or after floods when the land and water supply was stressed. The cost of maintaining oxen sometimes outweighed their benefits, particularly for poorer farmers who might only have one or two animals. Despite these difficulties, oxen remained essential because hand ploughing was nearly impossible on the tough, compacted soils of Mesopotamia. Oxen ploughing increased the area a farmer could work compared to manual digging, but the gains were limited by the animal's temperament and physical limits. In effect, farmers were still caught in a slow, exhausting battle to prepare their land. Furthermore, oxen were not always available to all farmers equally. Wealthier farmers or landowners could afford multiple oxen and better equipment, giving them an advantage in productivity. Poor farmers might have to borrow oxen or rent equipment, paying fees or giving up part of their harvest in exchange. This created economic pressure and dependency, deepening social inequalities within farming communities. Using oxen also introduced safety risks for the farmers. The animals could be unpredictable and dangerous if startled or frustrated. An ox might kick, trample, or buck, causing injuries to the farmer. Since farmers worked alone or with family members in remote fields, access to medical help was limited, meaning even minor injuries could become serious. The slow and difficult process of ploughing with oxen also influenced the timing of agricultural cycles. Because ploughing took so long, farmers had narrow windows between seasons to prepare land, plant seeds, and harvest crops. Any delays caused by oxen misbehavior, illness, or lack of animals could jeopardize the entire season's yield, with catastrophic consequences for the farmer and their family. Additionally, oxen could be affected by the very same environmental challenges that troubled farmers: floods, droughts, and extreme heat. Hot Mesopotamian summers could exhaust animals quickly, forcing farmers to stop working during the hottest parts of the day, further slowing progress. Floods could wash away pastures or contaminate water sources, leading to malnourished or sick animals. In times of conflict or raids, oxen were vulnerable targets. Raiders or enemy armies often seized livestock for food or to cripple the enemy's agricultural base. Losing oxen could ruin a farmer's ability to plough their land and produce crops, making recovery difficult or impossible without external help. The slow, awkward control of oxen also influenced the farming techniques employed. Because the animals were hard to maneuver, fields tended to be rectangular or follow simple geometric shapes to minimize difficult turns. This limited the ways farmers could optimize their land use and made irrigation design more rigid and constrained. In summary, while oxen were vital to the farming economy of ancient Mesopotamia, their use introduced a range of frustrations and hardships. The animals were slow, stubborn, and difficult to manage, making ploughing an exhausting and uncertain process. The farmer had to be part animal trainer, part laborer, constantly battling not just the earth, but the temperaments of these massive creatures. This reliance on oxen combined with the rudimentary tools and harsh environmental conditions made farming in Mesopotamia a tough, relentless occupation with few moments of ease or relief. In ancient Mesopotamia, irrigation was a crucial part of farming, but it came with serious downsides. The system of canals, ditches, and channels was designed to bring water from the rivers to fields, ensuring crops could grow even when rainfall was scarce. However, This constant presence of water also meant that large areas of standing water were common, especially in and around the irrigation canals. While this water was vital for crops, it created a perfect environment for diseases to spread, making life harder and more dangerous for farmers and their families. Standing water was a breeding ground for insects, particularly mosquitoes, which carried diseases that were unknown at the time but had devastating effects. Malaria, a mosquito-borne illness, likely caused repeated bouts of fever, weakness, and sometimes death among the population. Because there was no understanding of germs or how diseases spread, people had no effective way to prevent these illnesses. They just had to live with the sickness that came from the environment they depended on for survival. Not only did mosquitoes thrive, but other pests and parasites also found the stagnant water ideal for their life cycles. These parasites could infect humans, causing intestinal and skin diseases that weakened farmers, reducing their ability to work long hours in the fields. When a farmer was sick, the whole family suffered since the physical labor needed to maintain crops did not stop, even if someone was too weak to contribute. The constant dampness also affected the health of the soil and the farming environment. Wet conditions could lead to fungal growth on crops and plants, which not only destroyed harvests but could also cause allergic reactions or respiratory problems in farmers who breathed in spores or dust from moldy plants. This made the air in farming communities thick and unhealthy during certain times of the year. Beyond insects and fungi, standing water contaminated drinking supplies. Water stored or collected from these irrigation channels often contained harmful bacteria or parasites that caused stomach illnesses, diarrhea, and dehydration. These conditions were especially dangerous for children and the elderly, who were more vulnerable to losing strength or dying from repeated infections. The health toll from diseases linked to standing water meant that farmers were frequently ill, yet the demands of farming did not allow them to rest adequately. With crops to tend, irrigation canals to maintain, and livestock to care for, sickness often meant a loss of income and food, forcing farmers to push themselves to work even when their bodies were weak. In some cases, villages near irrigation systems had to deal with epidemics that wiped out significant portions of their populations. These outbreaks could happen seasonally, coinciding with periods when water was most abundant and stagnant. The loss of many workers at once crippled farming productivity, creating food shortages and famine that could affect entire regions. The presence of standing water also influenced settlement patterns. People had to live near their fields and irrigation systems to manage water flow and protect their crops, but this closeness to the water meant constant exposure to its dangers. Farmers couldn't simply move their homes away from the water because their livelihoods depended on it, trapping them in unhealthy environments. Traditional beliefs and religious practices often tried to explain the sickness linked to irrigation water. Some communities might have offered sacrifices or prayers to gods to protect them from disease, but there was no real understanding of the waterborne causes. This spiritual approach gave some comfort but no actual relief from the health problems caused by standing water. The constant battle against disease also shaped family dynamics and labor. When a member of a family fell ill due to water-related diseases, others had to compensate by working harder in the fields, increasing their own risk of exhaustion and injury. In many cases, entire families lived in cycles of illness and recovery, making it difficult to plan or prepare for the future. Because of these health risks, some farmers might have been reluctant to invest too much in irrigation or to expand their fields beyond a certain size. The threat of disease was a constant shadow over their work, influencing decisions about land use and farming techniques. This limited agricultural development and kept productivity lower than it might have been otherwise. Water management itself was a complex and ongoing challenge. Farmers had to dig and repair canals to prevent overflow and flooding, but they also needed to ensure water didn't stagnate. Achieving the right balance was difficult with the technology and knowledge available, and standing water was often the unfortunate result. In some cases, canals and irrigation ditches became clogged with silt and debris, causing water to pool in unintended places. This not only damaged crops but created new breeding sites for disease-carrying insects. Farmers spent significant time and effort cleaning and maintaining these waterways to reduce standing water, but the problem was never fully solved. The persistent health hazards from standing water contributed to the overall difficulty of farming life. It added to the exhaustion of long workdays and the uncertainty of weather and crop success. Illness could strike at any time, and without medical knowledge or treatment, it often meant a slow decline in health. Despite these dangers, irrigation remained essential. Without it, Mesopotamian agriculture would have been impossible due to the dry climate and unpredictable rainfall. Farmers had no choice but to accept the risks and try to manage them as best as they could. The legacy of these health challenges highlights the resilience of ancient Mesopotamian farmers. Their ability to continue farming under such conditions is a testament to their endurance and determination, even when faced with disease, exhaustion, and constant threats to their survival. Living and working with standing water meant that farmers and their families were always walking a fine line between life and sickness. Every irrigation season was not just a fight against nature's unpredictability but a struggle against invisible enemies carried by water and insects. It is hard to imagine the toll this took on their bodies and spirits, knowing that the very system designed to support their crops also endangered their health and well-being. This reality, combined with the other hardships of ancient Mesopotamian farming, paints a picture of a life full of struggle, persistence, and little reward. The standing water that was so vital to growing food also brought sickness and suffering, making farming in Mesopotamia a difficult and dangerous way to survive. One of the most relentless and unforgiving challenges that ancient Mesopotamian farmers faced was the constant threat posed by insects and mold to both their growing crops and their stored grain. In a world without modern pesticides, fungicides, or storage technologies, the humble farmer had to wage an ongoing war against these tiny enemies that could, in the blink of an eye, undo months of hard labor. The moment seeds were planted, they were exposed to a multitude of dangers that lurked in the environment. Pests that fed on young shoots and mature plants, and mold that could spread quickly under the right conditions, devastating the precious harvest. As the crops grew, swarms of insects like locusts, beetles, aphids, and caterpillars often descended upon the fields. These pests could strip leaves, eat seeds, and damage stalks, weakening plants and drastically reducing yields. Without any chemical deterrents, farmers had few ways to protect their fields, relying instead on manual labor to try to remove pests or scare them away. This was exhausting and often ineffective, especially during large infestations when the insects arrived in overwhelming numbers. A sudden invasion of locusts, for example, could wipe out entire fields within days, turning what should have been a fruitful season into a disaster. The damage wasn't limited to the plants themselves. Insects also posed a threat to the stored grain, which was vital for surviving through harsh seasons or food shortages. Once harvested, grain had to be kept safe from pests like weevils, beetles, and moths, which could infest storage containers and consume significant portions of the stockpile. Grain infested by insects was not only less nutritious but could also become unusable, forcing farmers and their families into hunger or financial hardship. Storing grain safely was a constant struggle, and losses from pests could be devastating. Alongside insect attacks, mold was a silent but deadly enemy to crops and stored food. Mold spores thrived in the warm, humid conditions that were common in the Mesopotamian climate, especially near irrigation canals and during periods of frequent watering. Once mold took hold in the fields, it could spread rapidly through the plants, rotting leaves, stems, and grains. Moldy crops not only yielded less food but also sometimes produced toxins harmful to humans and animals, although the farmers themselves would have had no knowledge of these dangers. Mold wasn't just a field problem, it also ruined stored grain, where moisture from the environment or poor storage conditions allowed it to flourish. Grain bins, often made from clay or woven materials, did not keep out moisture effectively, and any dampness could lead to mold growth inside the stored harvest. This resulted in large quantities of food becoming inedible or even poisonous, compounding the risk of famine during times when stored grain was critical. To combat insects and mold, farmers had to be vigilant throughout the year. During planting and growing seasons, they would inspect crops regularly, trying to remove pests by hand or using early forms of pest control like burning smelly substances to repel insects. After harvest, they had to find ways to dry grain thoroughly before storage, reducing moisture levels to prevent mold and pest infestations. This drying process required time and suitable weather conditions, which were not always available. If the grain was stored too wet or exposed to humidity, it was almost certain to spoil. The lack of protective technology and knowledge meant that many farmers faced huge losses every year, regardless of how hard they worked. Years of toil could be undone overnight by a swarm of locusts or an outbreak of mold in the granaries. These losses were not just economic, they directly affected families' ability to feed themselves and survive through difficult seasons. This constant threat from insects and mold also increased stress and anxiety among farming communities. Farmers never truly knew if their efforts would result in a successful harvest or if pests and disease would rob them of their livelihoods. The uncertainty forced them to live with a deep sense of insecurity, making it difficult to plan ahead or invest in improvements. Additionally, the presence of mold and insects in food stores affected the social standing and stability of families. Those who lost more of their harvest to pests might struggle to pay taxes or debts, risking punishment or worse. With no social safety nets in place, a bad year due to insects or mold could mean the difference between survival and destitution. The fight against these threats was complicated by the communal nature of irrigation and farming. Since water was shared, moisture levels could vary widely between fields and storage areas, and one farmer's failure to keep grain dry could have ripple effects on the community's food supply. Insects could easily move from one field or granary to another, spreading infestations rapidly and making control nearly impossible without coordinated efforts. Unfortunately, such coordination was limited by social and political structures. Farmers had little say in managing irrigation or storage practices on a larger scale, leaving them to deal with pests largely on their own. This isolation compounded their difficulties and left many to suffer losses that could have been mitigated with better collective management. On top of these natural challenges, the physical tools available to farmers for dealing with pests and mold were primitive. Without advanced containers or chemical treatments, protecting crops and stored grain was mostly a matter of vigilance, hard labor, and hope. This made every harvest season a gamble, and the stakes were high. The damage caused by insects and mold was not just a single event but an ongoing cycle that shaped the entire agricultural calendar. Farmers had to constantly prepare for infestations, monitor their fields, and take steps to protect what little they had. This cycle of vigilance and loss added a layer of mental and physical exhaustion to their already grueling lives. The toll on nutrition was also significant. Moldy or insect-damaged grain meant less food and poorer quality meals, contributing to malnutrition and weakened immune systems. This made farmers and their families more susceptible to disease, creating a vicious cycle where poor health made farming even harder. Despite these challenges, the farmers of ancient Mesopotamia developed some strategies to cope. They learned to store grain in elevated bins or buildings to keep it away from moisture and pests. Some also mixed different types of grain to try to reduce the spread of mold or insects. But these methods were limited and imperfect, offering only partial protection. Overall, the presence of insects and mold was a harsh, ever-present reminder of how precarious life was for a farmer in ancient Mesopotamia. It was a battle that could never truly be won, with small victories often overshadowed by large, devastating losses. The damage caused by these tiny but powerful forces highlights just how difficult and fragile farming was in this ancient civilization. Through all this, farmers continued to work tirelessly, knowing that the survival of their families and communities depended on their ability to resist these natural enemies. Their struggle with insects and mold was just one of many hardships that made farming in ancient Mesopotamia an exhausting and risky way to live. In ancient Mesopotamia, one of the most frustrating and demoralizing realities for farmers was that the land they toiled on from dawn to dusk was not theirs to own or freely control. Instead, the land belonged to the king or the ruling elite, and farmers were essentially tenants or laborers working under a system that left them with very little autonomy or security. This lack of land ownership shaped much of the farmers' experience and hardships, reinforcing their low social status and making their daily struggles feel even more hopeless. Unlike in some later societies where farmers might have held title to the land they cultivated, Mesopotamian farmers were often assigned plots by local officials or landowners who acted on behalf of the king. The farmer's main job was to produce crops to feed the population, pay taxes, and contribute to the king's wealth. However, because the land wasn't theirs, farmers had no long-term stake in improving or investing in it. If they tried to make permanent improvements, like repairing irrigation systems or enriching the soil, they could be relocated or lose access to that land without warning. This constant uncertainty undermined any hope of building a sustainable future. This system of land control also meant that the farmers were perpetually under the control of overseers or agents of the king who monitored their work and took a share of the produce. The farmers were expected to meet strict quotas, often leaving just enough food for their own families to survive. They were subject to harsh penalties if the harvest was insufficient, regardless of the reasons, whether floods, droughts, pests, or other natural disasters. Because the land was considered the king's property, the farmers were treated more like servants or workers than independent producers. The power imbalance created by land ownership also meant that farmers had no say in decisions about how land was distributed, managed, or used. The king and his officials controlled the distribution of land and could reassign it to whomever they wished, often rewarding loyal nobles or soldiers. This made it impossible for farmers to plan for the future or pass land down to their children, trapping families in a cycle of insecurity and dependence on the ruling class. This lack of ownership was deeply tied to the social structure of ancient Mesopotamia, which was highly stratified. Farmers were part of the lower classes, often at the mercy of nobles, priests, and officials who controlled economic and political power. The king's claim over the land reinforced this hierarchy, keeping farmers in a position where their labor enriched others while their own lives remained precarious. Furthermore, because the land belonged to the king, any major decisions about agriculture, such as which crops to grow, when to plant or harvest, or how irrigation canals should be maintained, were influenced or dictated by royal policies or temple authorities. Farmers had little room to innovate or adapt to local conditions on their own. This top-down control often meant that farming practices were rigid and slow to change, even if better methods might have improved yields or reduced hardship. This dynamic also complicated the relationship between farmers and the land itself. In many ancient agricultural societies, land ownership created a sense of stewardship and connection. But in Mesopotamia, since the farmers knew the land was only temporarily theirs, their motivation to care for it deeply was limited. They might focus on short-term survival rather than long-term fertility or soil conservation, leading to overuse and degradation of the soil over time. Another consequence of this system was the inability of farmers to build wealth or accumulate assets. Without land titles, they could not use their plots as collateral for loans or investments. This made it difficult to escape poverty or improve their standard of living. Instead, many farmers remained stuck in subsistence-level farming, vulnerable to debt and exploitation. The king's ownership of land also meant that farmers were heavily taxed, as the harvest was viewed as the king's revenue. Tax collectors acted as agents of the state, demanding a share of the crops that was often unfair and burdensome. Because farmers did not own the land, they were seen as mere producers whose primary function was to fill the king's granaries, regardless of their own needs or hardships. The control of land by the king also had legal implications. Land disputes were common, but farmers had little power to defend their claims. Royal courts typically sided with nobles or officials who represented the interests of the elite. This lack of legal protection further marginalized farmers and made them vulnerable to losing access to land and resources. This system of land ownership also affected the social and family life of farmers. Because they could be moved or lose their plots, families had little stability. Children might grow up never knowing if their family would have land to farm next season, making it difficult to plan for education, marriage, or community ties. The uncertainty permeated every aspect of life, adding emotional stress on top of physical toil. Moreover, the fact that farmers worked on royal land tied their fate closely to the political and military fortunes of the king. If the king faced external threats or internal unrest, farmers could be displaced, conscripted, or otherwise affected by the upheaval. Their land rights were always subordinate to the needs of the ruling elite, leaving them as pawns in larger political games. Even in times of relative peace, the economic pressures on farmers remained immense. Since the land was royal property, any improvements or investments they made could be taken away without compensation. This discouraged innovation and made it difficult for farming communities to develop infrastructure or techniques that could reduce hardship over generations. In addition, because the king owned the land, large tracts were often set aside for temples or royal estates. Farmers might be assigned to work on these lands as well, further reducing the land available for their own subsistence. The labor demands on these estates could be even harsher, as they were tied directly to the king's wealth and prestige. The concept of land ownership tied to the king also reflects the deeply centralized nature of Mesopotamian society. The king was not just a political leader but a god-appointed ruler whose ownership of the land was considered divine. This added a spiritual dimension to the control over land, making it even harder for farmers to resist or challenge their status. This divine ownership also meant that temples played a significant role in land management. Some farmers worked lands controlled by temples, paying tithes or offering labor in exchange for access. This added another layer of complexity and obligation, with farmers navigating demands from both royal and religious authorities. Ultimately, the fact that farmers in ancient Mesopotamia did not own the land they worked on meant that their labor primarily benefited others, kings, nobles, priests, while they themselves remained trapped in poverty and insecurity. Their lack of land rights was a fundamental reason why farming was so difficult and why their social position was so low. This reality shaped not just their economic life but their entire existence. The knowledge that the ground beneath their feet could be taken away, that their harvests belonged in part to others, and that they were at the mercy of distant rulers cast a long shadow over their daily lives. It was a crushing burden, making farming not only hard work but also a source of constant anxiety and helplessness. The absence of land ownership also stifled community development. Without secure rights, farmers had little incentive to build communal infrastructure, organize collectively to improve conditions. This lack of collective power kept farmers divided and easier to control by the elite. In many ways, the ownership of land by the king turned farmers into permanent laborers, denied the dignity and rewards that come from owning the fruits of their labor. This systemic inequality was one of the core reasons why life as a farmer in ancient Mesopotamia was so harsh and discouraging. Despite all these difficulties, farmers continued to work the land year after year, knowing that their survival and the survival of their communities depended on it. Yet, the absence of land ownership meant they were always vulnerable to loss, exploitation, and poverty, trapped in a cycle that was nearly impossible to escape. Life for farmers in ancient Mesopotamia was never safe or predictable, especially because their fields and homes were often vulnerable to raids and attacks by enemy armies or wandering raiders. These groups didn't just come occasionally, they could strike with brutal regularity, tearing through the countryside, destroying crops, stealing animals, and taking any food supplies they could find. For farmers, this meant that all the hard work of planting, tending, and harvesting crops could be wiped away overnight by violence beyond their control. Raids could be devastating for entire communities. When raiders descended, they didn't just take the harvest, they often burned fields, destroyed irrigation systems, and killed livestock. These actions not only stripped farmers of their current resources but also damaged the very foundation of their future farming efforts. Irrigation canals, which took months of labor to build and maintain, could be ruined in minutes, leaving fields dry and unusable until repaired. Since repairs required time and labor, often in dangerous conditions, recovery could take years. Enemy armies during times of war posed an even greater threat. Mesopotamia was frequently the battleground for clashes between city-states, kingdoms, and empires vying for control of the fertile land between the Tigris and Euphrates. When armies marched through farming regions, they often lived off the land, forcibly taking food, grain, and animals from farmers. Sometimes, farmers were forced to give supplies as part of tribute or to feed the soldiers, leaving less food for their own families. The presence of hostile forces often meant that farmers lived in a state of constant fear and uncertainty. They had to be prepared for the possibility of an attack at any time, which affected their ability to focus on planting and harvesting. The stress of knowing that all their work could be stolen or destroyed made farming psychologically draining. Many farmers had to guard their fields or organize local militias, which pulled them away from farming tasks and further reduced productivity. Raids and military campaigns also contributed to the cycle of poverty and vulnerability. After an attack, farmers might lose their stored grain, seeds, tools, and animals, all essential for the next planting season. Without these resources, planting was delayed or impossible, which meant no harvest, no food, and no income. This loss could push families into debt, hunger, or forced labor, deepening the hardship already faced by farmers. The threat of raids was worsened by the geography and politics of Mesopotamia. The flat plains and open terrain made it easy for raiders to move quickly across large areas, and the frequent conflict between city-states meant that borders were often insecure. Farmers living near contested zones or on the outskirts of kingdoms were especially vulnerable, caught in the crossfire or deliberately targeted to weaken an enemy. Sometimes raiders were not just external enemies but rival groups or even desperate farmers from other areas who turned to stealing out of necessity. This created tension and conflict between farming communities, reducing cooperation and trust, which was vital for managing shared resources like irrigation canals. In some cases, these disputes escalated into violence that further destabilized the region and damaged crops and infrastructure. Farmers had few means to protect themselves effectively. They lacked weapons, training, and organized defense forces. Most were simple people, focused on survival rather than warfare. When raiders came, the farmers' best defense was often to hide or flee, abandoning their fields and homes to the attackers. This meant not only losing crops but also the homes and possessions that represented years of hard work and saving. In response to these dangers, some city-states built walls or fortifications around agricultural areas, but these were limited in scope and often left many farming villages exposed. The costs of defense fell largely on the farmers themselves, who had to contribute labor, materials, or taxes to maintain city defenses. Yet even with walls, raiders sometimes found ways to circumvent protection through surprise attacks or by targeting unprotected farms farther from the cities. The destruction caused by raids also had ripple effects throughout Mesopotamian society. When farms were destroyed or supplies stolen, food shortages could follow, causing prices to rise and hunger to spread. This could lead to unrest in cities, increased crime, and social instability, all of which further hurt the farmers, who were the backbone of the food supply but also the most vulnerable. During wartime, farmers faced additional burdens as they were sometimes conscripted or forced to provide support to armies, whether by supplying food, labor, or even fighting. This removed able-bodied workers from the fields at critical times, reducing agricultural output and leaving families to struggle alone. Those who went to war often returned injured or not at all, weakening the community's ability to farm. Even when raids or military attacks didn't occur, the constant threat shaped how farmers lived and worked. They might avoid planting certain valuable crops that would be easy targets or limit how much grain they stored, knowing that large supplies could attract thieves or soldiers. This cautious approach meant farmers often accepted lower yields or reduced profits to avoid the risk of total loss. The emotional toll of living under the threat of raids was heavy. Farmers had to balance hope and despair as they watched their crops grow, knowing that months of labor could vanish in a single night. This uncertainty undermined the sense of security that might have otherwise come from working the land and providing for one's family. Instead, the future felt fragile, controlled by forces far beyond their control. In some cases, farmers tried to band together in groups or villages to create informal protections, warning systems, or shared defenses. These community efforts could reduce the impact of raids but required coordination and trust, which was sometimes difficult in a harsh and competitive environment. Internal conflicts over resources or water rights sometimes made cooperation even harder. The constant risk of raids also influenced the legal and political structure of Mesopotamian society. Kings and officials used the threat of external enemies to justify strict control over farming communities, increased taxation, and conscription. Farmers were often caught between the needs of their rulers and the dangers posed by outside attackers, forced to bear heavy burdens from both sides. Moreover, the destruction of farms during raids affected not just the farmers but the entire economic system. Grain was a form of wealth, used to pay workers, taxes, and temple offerings. Losing these resources weakened not only individual farmers but also the financial stability of cities and temples, leading to further hardship and conflict. Over time, repeated raids could depopulate farming regions, forcing some villages to abandon their lands altogether. This abandonment meant that fertile fields lay fallow, reducing the overall productivity of the region and weakening the kingdom's food security. For farmers, displacement meant losing homes, community ties, and a way of life that had sustained families for generations. In the face of these threats, some farmers might try to diversify their livelihoods by engaging in crafts, trade, or working for temples or palaces. But such alternatives were limited and often required connections or skills that farmers lacked. Most remained dependent on the uncertain and dangerous work of farming the king's land. The cyclical nature of raids and recovery also meant that farmers were trapped in a constant state of rebuilding. Each attack required repairing canals, replanting fields, and replacing lost animals and tools, a process that took months or years. This cycle consumed time and energy that could have been spent improving farming methods or increasing productivity. Despite these enormous challenges, farmers in Mesopotamia showed remarkable resilience. They continued to plant, irrigate, and harvest under the shadow of violence, driven by necessity and the hope that the next season might be better. Yet the presence of raiders and armies was a constant reminder of how vulnerable they were, adding a layer of fear and insecurity to every moment spent working the land. In summary, the threat and reality of raids and enemy attacks made farming in ancient Mesopotamia an even harsher and more precarious existence. The destruction of crops, theft of supplies, and disruption of irrigation systems turned the farmer's life into a constant struggle against forces both natural and human. Their labor, already grueling and uncertain, was vulnerable to violence that could erase months of hard work and threaten their very survival. This insecurity was a fundamental reason why being a farmer in ancient Mesopotamia was an incredibly difficult and often devastating way to live. In ancient Mesopotamia, when wars broke out between city-states or kingdoms, the farmers were often among the first people called upon to serve in the army. Unlike modern times, where standing armies are professional and permanent, ancient Mesopotamian armies were largely made up of ordinary citizens, and farmers formed the backbone of this system. This meant that during times of conflict, farmers were pulled away from their fields, leaving their crops unattended and their families vulnerable. The burden of war fell heavily on these hard-working people who were already struggling to maintain their livelihoods. The conscription of farmers into the military was not a voluntary process. Often, they had little choice but to leave their homes and fields to fight for their city or king. The consequences of refusal could be severe, including punishment, fines, or worse. Because of this, many farmers had to juggle the responsibility of tending to their farms with the looming threat of being drafted. This created an atmosphere of anxiety and uncertainty, as they knew that any moment, their lives could be upended by the call to arms. When farmers were conscripted, they faced the dangers and hardships of ancient warfare. Battles in Mesopotamia were brutal and chaotic, fought with swords, spears, bows, and chariots. Training was often minimal, and many farmers had no previous experience in combat. Despite this, they had to march long distances, endure harsh weather conditions, and confront skilled enemies. The risk of injury or death was high, and many never returned to their farms or families. The impact of losing able-bodied farmers to war was deeply felt in agricultural communities. With men gone to fight, the workload on those left behind, often women, children, and the elderly, increased dramatically. These family members had to manage the planting, watering, weeding, and harvesting of crops, often without the strength or experience of the primary laborers. This imbalance meant that the quality and quantity of the harvest could suffer, leading to food shortages and economic difficulties. Even when farmers returned from war, the transition back to farming life was challenging. Many came back injured, traumatized, or physically weakened, which limited their ability to perform demanding agricultural tasks. Some might have lost their land or possessions during their absence, while others found their homes damaged or their families struggling to survive. The psychological toll of war also lingered, affecting motivation and community cohesion. Additionally, the presence of soldiers drawn from farming populations sometimes caused tension within villages. Returning veterans might be physically changed or socially altered by their experiences, creating divides between those who fought and those who stayed behind. This dynamic could weaken community bonds and complicate cooperation in managing shared resources like irrigation canals and communal land. In times of prolonged conflict, the cycle of conscription and return could become a continuous strain. Some farmers might be drafted multiple times over their lifetimes, never fully able to focus on building stable, prosperous farms. This instability discouraged investment in land improvements or long-term planning, trapping farming families in a survival mindset rather than growth and development. The demands of military service also extended beyond the battlefield. Farmers could be required to provide supplies such as food, animals, and tools to support armies, further depleting their limited resources. The obligation to feed soldiers and their animals placed enormous pressure on agricultural output, often reducing what was left for families and local communities. During times of war, political leaders frequently imposed additional taxes or levies on farming communities to fund military campaigns. These extra burdens compounded the hardships faced by farmers who were already struggling with conscription and disrupted farming cycles. The loss of crops and labor during these periods could mean that entire regions faced famine or economic collapse. Conscription also disproportionately affected poorer farmers who had fewer means to avoid military service or to protect their land and families during their absence. Wealthier landowners might have had the resources to hire laborers or pay exemptions, while poorer families bore the full brunt of war's demands. This inequality deepened social divisions and limited opportunities for upward mobility within rural societies. The relationship between farming and warfare in Mesopotamia was cyclical and destructive. Wars required farmers to fight and supply armies, which reduced agricultural productivity. Reduced productivity led to food shortages and economic strain, which in turn fueled more conflicts over scarce resources. This vicious cycle meant that farmers lived under a constant shadow of instability, making their already difficult lives even more precarious. Moreover, the cultural expectations of loyalty and duty to the city or king meant that farmers rarely questioned their military obligations. Serving in the army was seen as a necessary sacrifice for the survival and honor of their community. However, this sense of duty came at a steep personal cost, with many farmers losing their health, land, or lives in the process. The military service of farmers also shaped the political landscape of Mesopotamia. Kings and rulers relied heavily on conscripted farmers to maintain their power and defend their territories. This dependence gave rulers leverage over rural populations, reinforcing systems of control and exploitation. Farmers, with little political voice or power, were compelled to comply with demands they could neither influence nor escape. In some cases, conscripted farmers might have been used as frontline soldiers or expendable forces in battles, reflecting their low social status and limited value in the eyes of rulers. This expendability added to the risks and fears associated with military service, reinforcing the sense that farmers were both vital and undervalued. The interruption of farming cycles due to conscription also meant that when peace returned, recovery was slow. Fields left unattended during planting or harvesting could yield poor crops or fail entirely. Repairing irrigation systems damaged during conflict took time and labor, delaying the return to normal agricultural productivity. Families left behind had to adapt to the absence of their primary breadwinners. Women, children, and elderly relatives took on additional responsibilities, sometimes working the fields themselves or managing household affairs under difficult conditions. These efforts were vital for survival but also placed heavy physical and emotional demands on those left at home. The pressure of knowing that their loved ones might never return from war cast a constant shadow over farming households. The fear of loss, combined with the stress of maintaining farms without help, created a harsh and often desperate existence. This reality was far from the romantic or heroic images sometimes associated with ancient warfare. Despite these hardships, many farmers accepted their role as soldiers out of necessity, loyalty, or lack of alternatives. Their contributions to military campaigns were crucial in shaping the history and borders of Mesopotamian civilizations, even as their personal sacrifices went largely unrecognized in historical records. The requirement for farmers to serve in the army during wars was a clear example of how their lives were controlled and constrained by forces beyond their control. They were essential to the survival of their cities and kingdoms, yet their own well-being was often secondary to political and military ambitions. In the end, being a farmer in ancient Mesopotamia meant constantly balancing the demands of agriculture with the unpredictable needs of war. The threat of conscription loomed over every planting and harvest season, reminding farmers that their hard work could be interrupted at any moment by the call to fight for causes that might seem distant or abstract compared to the immediate need to feed their families. This intertwining of farming and military service shaped not only individual lives but the very fabric of Mesopotamian society, creating a cycle of labor, loss, and survival that defined the experience of being a farmer in one of the world's earliest civilizations. In ancient Mesopotamia, the social structure was rigid and clearly defined, making it nearly impossible for farmers to escape the social class they were born into. Unlike some societies where social mobility, though limited, was still a possibility through wealth, marriage, or achievement, the farmers of Mesopotamia were essentially locked into their roles for life. This meant that from the moment a child was born into a farming family, their future was almost predetermined, working the land, facing hardship, and living in a lower social class without any real opportunity to improve their standing. Farmers were considered part of the lower strata of society, just above slaves but below merchants, priests, scribes, and nobles. Their lives were centered on physical labor, tied closely to the land and the seasons, and largely disconnected from the privileges and luxuries enjoyed by the upper classes. The wealthiest landowners and rulers owned most of the land, leaving farmers to work as tenants or sharecroppers with little hope of acquiring property of their own. This lack of upward mobility was not just a result of economic barriers but also deeply rooted in cultural and legal systems. For instance, laws codified in the famous Hammurabi's Code reinforced social roles and responsibilities, often punishing those who tried to overstep their social boundaries. The legal system maintained the status quo by ensuring that farmers remained tied to their land and duties, limiting their ability to change their social position through education, wealth accumulation, or political influence. Education, which was a key pathway to social advancement in many ancient societies, was almost completely out of reach for farmers. Literacy was rare, and only the elite, such as scribes and priests, were taught to read and write cuneiform, the complex script used in Mesopotamia. Since literacy was directly tied to administrative and religious power, farmers remained excluded from positions that could offer more influence or wealth. Without the ability to read or write, farmers were at the mercy of officials who collected taxes and enforced laws, unable to advocate effectively for themselves. Furthermore, the economic structure reinforced this social immobility. Most farmers worked small plots of land owned by the king, temples, or wealthy landlords, and their income was often meager. After paying taxes and rent, there was little surplus left for investment or saving. Without capital, farmers could not purchase land or tools to increase productivity or wealth. This economic stagnation kept them trapped in a cycle of subsistence farming, where daily survival was the primary concern rather than advancement. Marriage and family life also reflected this lack of social mobility. Farmers typically married within their class, and children were expected to follow in their parents' footsteps, learning farming skills from a young age. The family unit was centered on agricultural labor, and children contributed to the farm work rather than pursuing education or trades that might offer social elevation. Social connections that might help advance one's status were limited, as farmers rarely interacted with or had access to the elites who controlled political and economic power. Even religious life, which could sometimes provide pathways to status through priesthood, was mostly inaccessible to farmers. Priestly roles were usually reserved for specific families or social groups, often from noble backgrounds. Farmers could participate in religious ceremonies and festivals, but these were more about communal ritual and less about personal advancement or authority. The physical conditions of farming life further emphasized social division. While the wealthy lived in larger, better-built homes with access to luxury goods and protection, farmers lived in simple mud-brick houses with few comforts. Their daily struggles with the harsh environment, unpredictable weather, and difficult labor starkly contrasted with the relative ease of the upper classes. This visible inequality reinforced social hierarchies and a sense of resignation among farmers about their place in society. Social status also influenced legal protections and punishments. Laws often differentiated between social classes, with harsher penalties for those in lower ranks. For farmers, this meant they had fewer legal rights and protections compared to nobles or merchants. Disputes over land, water, or crops often favored the wealthy, further marginalizing farmers and reinforcing their vulnerable position. The lack of political power was another critical factor in maintaining social immobility. Farmers had little to no influence over decisions made by city rulers or councils, who were dominated by the elite. Their concerns and needs were frequently ignored or subordinated to the interests of powerful landowners and officials. Without representation, farmers had no effective means to push for reforms that might improve their status or conditions. In times of crisis, such as famine or war, farmers were the hardest hit but also the least able to recover or seek assistance. Social welfare systems were minimal or non-existent, and the responsibility to survive fell squarely on the farmer and their family. This lack of safety nets reinforced the precarious nature of their existence and the limited avenues for change. Religious beliefs and cultural norms also played a role in shaping farmers' acceptance of their social position. The idea that one's place in society was divinely ordained was common, and many accepted their hardships as part of a cosmic order. This belief discouraged rebellion or attempts to challenge the social hierarchy, as doing so was seen as going against the gods or natural law. In some cases, farmers might have tried to improve their situations through hard work, frugality, or small business activities like trading surplus crops, but these efforts rarely translated into significant social advancement. The barriers created by land ownership, legal restrictions, and social prejudice were simply too strong to overcome. The psychological impact of this rigid social structure on farmers cannot be underestimated. Living with the knowledge that their children would likely face the same hardships and limitations bred a sense of despair and resignation. The lack of hope for a better future made life even harder, as the motivation to improve one's condition diminished under the weight of systemic inequality. Despite these bleak realities, farmers continued to work the land, sustaining Mesopotamian society by producing the food necessary for the survival of cities and elites alike. Their labor underpinned the entire civilization, yet their own lives were marked by hardship, limited opportunity, and social invisibility. This social immobility also ensured that the ruling classes retained their power and control over resources. By keeping farmers locked in their class, the elites prevented the emergence of new challengers or shifts in the balance of power. The stability of this system depended on the acceptance and enforcement of these rigid social boundaries. In essence, being a farmer in ancient Mesopotamia was not only physically demanding but also socially confining. The inability to rise beyond their class meant that farmers had to endure the harsh realities of their lives without hope for change, making their existence one of persistent struggle and limited reward. This harsh reality stood in stark contrast to the importance of their role. Without farmers, there would be no food, no wealth, and no civilization. Yet their contributions were undervalued, and their potential suppressed by a social order designed to keep them in place. Their story is a reminder of how ancient societies often depended on the labor and suffering of the many to sustain the privileges of the few, a dynamic that shaped human history for millennia. The summer heat in ancient Mesopotamia was relentless and unforgiving. Unlike many modern societies where air conditioning and insulated buildings provide relief, farmers endured the blistering sun with virtually no protection. The climate in the region was characterized by long, hot summers where temperatures could soar well above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, around 38 degrees Celsius. This intense heat was not just uncomfortable, it was physically exhausting and posed real dangers to health and productivity. The very act of working the land under such conditions was a test of endurance and resilience. Farming under the sun's blazing glare meant long hours exposed to harsh ultraviolet rays. Since the majority of farmers worked from sunrise to sunset, there was little respite from the heat during the day. They could not simply stop work or retreat to cooler areas because their livelihood depended on constant labor. This exposure led to dehydration, sunstroke, heat exhaustion, and severe fatigue. These conditions made the hard physical labor even more grueling and increased the risk of serious illness. The architecture of the time did not provide much relief either. Most farmers lived in simple mud brick homes, which offered minimal insulation against the heat. While mud bricks can keep interiors cooler than stone or wood in some climates, the protection was limited, especially in the summer months when temperatures remained high both day and night. There were no advanced cooling systems, fans, or even effective shading devices that could have helped alleviate the heat indoors. At best, farmers could rest in the shade of their homes or under sparse tree cover, but such shade was rare in the largely open agricultural fields where they worked. The lack of protective clothing also added to the discomfort. The typical attire was made from linen or wool, materials that could be heavy and warm in the heat. While linen can be somewhat breathable, the clothing styles and the need to protect against sunburn and insect bites meant farmers were often wrapped up despite the heat. Head coverings, necessary to prevent sunstroke, were often made from cloth or animal hides but offered only limited protection. Because of the heat, farmers often had to carry water with them to stay hydrated, but access to clean water was not always guaranteed. They might drink from rivers or irrigation canals, which were sometimes contaminated and could lead to illness. The physical demands of farming combined with extreme heat and limited hydration options created a dangerous environment for the body. The summer heat also affected the crops themselves, adding another layer of difficulty. High temperatures could dry out the soil, making it harder for plants to grow and requiring more careful irrigation. For farmers, this meant constant attention to water management, ensuring that their fields did not dry out or become overly salty from evaporation. Heat stress on crops could reduce yields or cause entire harvests to fail, which directly impacted the farmers' food supply and income. Because there was no cool shelter, farmers had little choice but to work during the hottest parts of the day, increasing their exposure. Unlike in some cultures where midday rest or siestas were common to avoid the worst heat, Mesopotamian farmers often had to keep going. Their survival depended on it, and the demands of the agricultural cycle left little room for rest or adjustment. The extreme temperatures also influenced the health of entire farming families. Children, elderly, and those who were ill were still exposed to the same harsh conditions, as there was no effective shelter to protect them. This vulnerability often resulted in higher rates of heat-related sickness and mortality among farming communities. Moreover, the summer heat worsened problems with insects and pests, which thrived in warm, humid conditions. Flies, mosquitoes, and other biting insects were not only a nuisance but also vectors for disease. The intense sun and heat combined with stagnant irrigation water created ideal breeding grounds for these pests, further threatening the health of farmers and their families. In such an environment, working the land was physically draining to the point where many farmers likely suffered chronic exhaustion and weakness during the peak heat months. The constant battle against the sun's intensity could reduce productivity, affect the quality of the work, and increase the likelihood of accidents or injuries due to fatigue. Farmers also had to deal with the psychological toll of working in such conditions. The oppressive heat and endless physical labor, with little chance for rest or relief, could lead to despair, stress, and a sense of helplessness. Knowing that they had to endure such hardship day after day, year after year, without any improvement in their living or working conditions, weighed heavily on their spirits. Because of these challenges, the summer season was probably the most dreaded time of year for farmers. It was a period when every task became a struggle against not just nature, but the limits of the human body. Despite this, the growing season was vital, and the crops needed attention during this time, so farmers had no choice but to push through the heat. Interestingly, some strategies might have been used to mitigate the worst effects of the heat, such as working during the cooler early mornings and late afternoons. But given the sheer volume of work needed during planting and harvest, breaks were often brief and infrequent. The pressure to maintain irrigation canals, tend crops, and prepare for harvests was unrelenting, forcing farmers to labor in dangerous conditions. In contrast to the upper classes, who had access to better shelter, water supplies, and the help of servants or slaves, farmers bore the full brunt of the climate with minimal assistance. This disparity highlighted the social inequalities embedded within Mesopotamian society, where the physical environment was another factor that deepened the hardships faced by the lower classes. Even at night, relief was limited. Without modern fans or cooling devices, the heat often lingered, making sleep difficult and recovery from the day's labor incomplete. Poor sleep would have further reduced farmers' energy and resilience for the next day's work. This constant exposure to the summer heat without adequate protection or shelter was one of many factors that made farming in ancient Mesopotamia such a hard and unforgiving life. It tested the endurance of farmers and their families every single year, shaping their daily existence and their very survival. In summary, the relentless summer heat, combined with minimal shelter, limited clothing options, scarce clean water, and the demands of constant labor, created an environment that was harsh and exhausting for Mesopotamian farmers. The natural environment was unforgiving, and the lack of protective measures made every day a difficult battle against the elements. This brutal climate was a fundamental part of why life as a farmer in ancient Mesopotamia was so difficult. It shaped the rhythms of daily life, influenced health outcomes, and contributed to the overall hardship that defined farming in this ancient civilization. The farmers' endurance in the face of such relentless heat stands as a testament to their resilience, but also highlights the immense challenges they faced simply to survive and sustain their society. Storing grain in ancient Mesopotamia was a challenge fraught with constant threats and uncertainty, making the preservation of the vital harvest a continual struggle for farmers. After months of exhausting labor sowing, tending, and harvesting crops, the next hurdle was ensuring that the precious grain, wheat, barley, and other staples, would remain safe and usable for as long as possible. Unfortunately, the technology and methods available at the time were far from foolproof, and farmers faced relentless problems such as infestations, spoilage, and moisture damage that could decimate their food stores. One of the biggest dangers to stored grain was the presence of mice and other rodents. These small creatures were attracted by the abundance of food stored in granaries, pits, or clay jars. Once inside the storage areas, they would gnaw through sacks, containers, and even earthen walls to reach the grain. Not only did mice consume significant portions of the stored harvest, but their droppings and urine also contaminated the remaining grain, rendering it unsafe or unpleasant to eat. For farmers who had invested so much effort to produce their crops, losing a large share of their harvest to rodents was a devastating blow that threatened their food security for months to come. Moisture was another major enemy of stored grain. Mesopotamia's climate, while generally dry, had a rainy season and periods of high humidity. Inadequate storage facilities often allowed water to seep in, either from rain, flooding, or groundwater rising through the soil. When grain absorbed moisture, it created the perfect conditions for mold and rot to develop. Mold could spread quickly through a grain store, discoloring and spoiling the kernels, and making the grain inedible or unsafe. Not only did this spoilage waste valuable food, but consuming moldy grain could cause sickness or even death, compounding the already precarious health conditions of farming families. Farmers typically stored grain in simple pits dug into the ground or in clay or mud brick granaries built near their homes or fields. While these storage methods provided some protection from the elements, they were far from ideal. Pits could be prone to flooding or water seepage, while above-ground granaries were vulnerable to damage from the weather, pests, and temperature fluctuations. These rudimentary storage methods lacked the tight seals or pest control measures necessary to keep the grain safe long-term. The quality of storage containers was also a limiting factor. Bags made from woven reeds, animal hides, or coarse cloth were common, but these materials were not completely rodent-proof or moisture-resistant. Clay jars with lids could help protect the grain better but were expensive to produce and could break easily. Additionally, farmers often had limited access to sufficient numbers of containers, forcing them to stack grain loosely or in large piles, which increased the risk of spoilage. Another issue was the lack of knowledge or resources to properly manage grain storage. Understanding how to keep grain dry, ventilated, and protected from pests was limited by the technology and scientific knowledge of the time. This meant farmers relied heavily on trial and error, local tradition, and whatever small-scale measures they could apply, such as spreading ashes around storage areas to deter rodents or carefully covering grain with straw or mats. Despite these efforts, many losses were inevitable. Stored grain was not only at risk from rodents and moisture but also from insects. Weevils and other grain pests could infest stored supplies, eating kernels and laying eggs that would hatch into larvae inside the grain itself. This invisible destruction could go unnoticed until large portions of the harvest were compromised. Controlling these pests was nearly impossible with the tools and knowledge available to ancient farmers. The consequences of losing stored grain went beyond immediate hunger. Grain was often used not only for feeding the family but also as a form of wealth, trade, and payment of taxes. Losing a significant portion of the harvest to spoilage or pests meant farmers had less to eat, less to sell or barter, and less to give to the ruling class or temple authorities. This economic loss could plunge families deeper into debt or poverty and increase their vulnerability to famine or social punishment. In some cases, entire communities could be affected if grain stores were ruined on a large scale, leading to shortages and social unrest. The dependence on grain as the staple food and economic backbone of Mesopotamian society meant that storage failures were a major risk factor for widespread hunger and instability. Farmers had to work hard not only to produce grain but also to protect what they had harvested. This often meant extra labor during harvest season to dry grain properly before storage, constant monitoring of storage facilities, and attempts at pest control. The physical and mental toll of guarding against these losses added to the already heavy burdens farmers faced. The threat of spoilage was compounded by the cyclical nature of farming life. Each year, after the intense labor of growing crops, the harvest needed to be carefully managed to ensure survival through the next planting season and beyond. Losing stored grain was not a temporary inconvenience but a potential disaster that could affect the family's food supply for months, forcing them to rely on uncertain sources or go hungry. Beyond the technical challenges, the insecurity of grain storage contributed to a persistent sense of vulnerability among farmers. The fear that their hard-earned harvest might be ruined by forces beyond their control, pests, moisture, rodents, was a constant shadow hanging over their lives. This insecurity would have affected their planning, their risk tolerance, and their overall quality of life. This situation also highlights the inequalities within Mesopotamian society. Wealthier landowners or temple complexes might have had better storage facilities and more resources to protect their grain, while small-scale farmers struggled with the most basic and inadequate means of preservation. Such disparities reinforced the harsh realities of social stratification and the difficult conditions endured by the majority who farmed the land. In summary, the process of storing grain in ancient Mesopotamia was fraught with peril. Mice and rodents consumed and contaminated supplies, moisture and rot spoiled grain, insects infested stored crops, and limited technology made it difficult to protect this vital resource effectively. For farmers, the stakes were incredibly high, losing stored grain threatened not only their survival but their economic standing and social stability. Despite all their hard work during the growing season, the battle to keep their harvest safe was never truly won. The constant vigilance required to maintain grain stores was just another aspect of the relentless hardships that made farming in ancient Mesopotamia a difficult and precarious existence. This struggle over something as fundamental as food storage underscores the fragile balance farmers lived in, one where natural forces, pests, and technology limitations could undo months of effort in an instant. The rivers Tigris and Euphrates were the lifeblood of ancient Mesopotamia, bringing water to the dry lands and allowing farming to flourish in an otherwise harsh environment. But despite their importance, these rivers were far from reliable friends. Their behavior was notoriously unpredictable, creating a cycle of hope and despair for farmers who depended on their waters. The rivers could be calm and gentle one year, then violent and destructive the next, making life extremely difficult and precarious for those trying to work the land. The Tigris and Euphrates did not follow a fixed schedule or pattern that could be easily anticipated. Their flow was heavily influenced by seasonal rains and melting snow from distant mountains, which varied year to year. Some years, the rivers flooded wildly, overflowing their banks and spreading across vast areas of farmland. Other years, they barely reached the fields at all, leaving the soil parched and cracked under the scorching sun. This unpredictability meant farmers lived in constant uncertainty, never sure whether the coming season would bring abundant water or devastating drought. When the rivers flooded, the results were often catastrophic. Although some flooding was necessary for replenishing soil nutrients, extreme floods washed away topsoil, seeds, and young plants, destroying months of labor in a matter of hours or days. Entire fields could be underwater, with crops drowned or swept away by the rushing currents. In some cases, homes, storage buildings, and irrigation structures were damaged or destroyed as well. The emotional toll of watching hard work vanish beneath floodwaters must have been immense. But the danger did not end when the floodwaters receded. Because the rivers changed their courses suddenly, they sometimes carved new paths across the landscape. This shift could leave farmers with dry fields where water once flowed, or waterlogged land where dry soil was expected. Irrigation canals, essential for directing water to crops, might be rendered useless if the river moved, forcing farmers to rebuild and redig canals over and over again. The constant need to adjust to shifting river patterns added to the relentless labor farmers faced. At times, the rivers would simply fail to bring enough water at all. During dry spells or years with insufficient rainfall upstream, the Tigris and Euphrates diminished to a trickle. This left farmers scrambling to find ways to irrigate their fields with limited resources. Without enough water, crops wilted and failed, threatening famine and economic ruin. The consequences of river droughts were just as harsh as floods, demonstrating the double-edged nature of these vital waterways. The complexity of managing water in such a variable environment led to the development of extensive irrigation systems, but these too were vulnerable to the river's erratic behavior. Canals and levees could be breached or buried under silt deposits after floods, requiring constant repair. Water rights became contentious as neighboring farmers competed for access to the scarce resource. When the rivers changed course or flooded unpredictably, those with fields farthest from the main channels could lose access entirely, exacerbating social tensions. Furthermore, the sudden flooding or retreat of the rivers often brought silt and debris that damaged farmland and irrigation works. While silt was generally beneficial for enriching soil, excessive sediment could clog canals and bury crops or seeds. Clearing this silt required labor-intensive work, adding to farmers' burdens. Additionally, debris carried by floods, such as uprooted trees, stones, and trash, had to be removed to restore fields and canals, consuming precious time and energy. The behavior of the rivers also affected the timing of agricultural activities. Farmers depended on the rivers to flood at just the right time to water their fields and deposit fertile silt. If floods came too early or too late, crops could fail. This forced farmers into a constant cycle of observation and adjustment, trying to predict the river's moods and work around their whims. Since no modern meteorology or hydrology existed, this was a gamble fraught with risk. This unpredictability also influenced settlement patterns. Some villages and farming communities had to relocate repeatedly due to river changes. Fields and homes might be abandoned when the river's new course left them isolated from water or exposed to flooding. Such displacement disrupted lives and communities, forcing families to rebuild from scratch and cope with the loss of familiar land. The river's sudden and violent shifts could also affect trade and transportation. Mesopotamian cities depended on river navigation for moving goods and resources, so changes in water levels and currents had economic impacts beyond farming. When river conditions were unfavorable, markets could suffer, and supplies became harder to obtain, indirectly impacting farmers' ability to get tools, seeds, or relief in hard times. For farmers, this meant living with a constant awareness of nature's unpredictability and power. The Tigris and Euphrates were both a source of life and a cause of suffering, embodying a natural force beyond human control. While irrigation and canal building were ingenious responses, the river's behavior ultimately reminded farmers of their vulnerability in the face of the environment. Moreover, this unpredictability reinforced the social hierarchies of ancient Mesopotamia. Those with resources to repair canals quickly or access better land closer to stable water sources had an advantage. Poorer farmers bore the brunt of river floods or droughts and lacked the means to recover easily. The rivers thus played a role in perpetuating inequality, as access to water and fertile land could determine a family's survival and prosperity. In mythology and religion, the river's moods were often linked to the god's favor or wrath, adding a spiritual dimension to the farmer's struggles. Prayers, offerings, and rituals sought to appease the gods controlling the waters, but these actions offered little practical relief. The farmer's relationship with the rivers was as much about faith and hope as about practical irrigation. Overall, the changing behavior of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers presented a constant and daunting challenge to ancient Mesopotamian farmers. The unpredictability of floods, droughts, shifting river courses, and silt deposits created a precarious existence marked by relentless labor, uncertainty, and risk. Every year, the success or failure of the harvest hinged on forces that farmers could neither fully predict nor control, shaping their lives in profound and often harsh ways. Despite their vital importance, these rivers demanded a heavy toll in physical, emotional, and economic terms. For the farmers who lived and worked along their banks, the Tigris and Euphrates were both a blessing and a curse, defining the delicate balance between survival and disaster in ancient Mesopotamia. When harvest season arrived in ancient Mesopotamia, the rhythm of daily life changed completely for farmers. For months leading up to that crucial time, they had labored under the hot sun, tending crops, repairing irrigation, and guarding against threats. But once the crops ripened and the grain turned golden, there was no room for rest or delay. The harvest demanded non-stop work from sunrise to sunset, every single day, with no breaks or days off. The pressure to gather the crop quickly and efficiently was immense, and the toll on farmers' bodies and spirits was exhausting. Harvest time was the busiest and most stressful period in a farmer's year. Unlike other tasks that could be paced or postponed, harvesting had a narrow window when crops were at their peak. If farmers hesitated too long, grains could spoil or fall prey to pests, and the entire year's work would be wasted. This urgency forced farmers to push themselves and their families to the limit, working from the first light of dawn until the sky turned dark. There was little opportunity to eat proper meals or rest in the shade, as every moment counted. The work itself was incredibly demanding. Harvesting grain meant cutting stalks by hand, using simple sickles made from flint or metal, tools that required skill and strength to use all day long. The repetitive motion of bending, cutting, and gathering was physically taxing. Farmers often suffered from sore backs, aching arms, and blisters on their hands. Yet the pace could not slacken, as neighbors, tax collectors, and landlords all expected the harvest to be completed quickly. Families worked together during this period. Everyone from children to elders was expected to contribute. Children helped carry bundles of grain, women gathered and threshed, and men wielded sickles and managed oxen for plowing or transporting. There was no rest even for the elderly or the sick, who had to push through pain and fatigue to avoid losing their share of food or risking punishment. The entire community often came together in a cooperative effort, yet the burden still fell hardest on individual farmers and their kin. Food availability during harvest was also precarious. Ironically, despite working long hours in the fields, farmers often had little time to prepare nourishing meals. Many ate simple, dry bread or barley porridge while standing in the sun or between work tasks. Proper meals were a luxury during this season, and hunger or dehydration could weaken workers further. Yet resting too long was impossible. Crops needed to be cut and stored before they spoiled. The pressure of non-stop labor was compounded by the fact that harvesting coincided with the hottest part of the year. Mesopotamian summers were brutal, with fierce sun beating down on open fields. There was no shade, no cool shelter, and little relief from the heat. Working under such conditions led to exhaustion, heat stroke, and dehydration for many. Still, the work could not stop. Stopping meant losing the harvest, and with it, the family's survival. Even after the grain was cut, the work was far from over. Threshing, winnowing, and storing grain demanded more time and effort. These processes were necessary to separate edible kernels from chaff and prepare the grain for storage. Every step required careful attention to prevent spoilage or loss. If farmers tried to rest before completing these tasks, pests or mold could ruin their hard-won harvest. Additionally, farmers had to manage the logistics of transporting grain to storage facilities or market. Without modern tools or transportation, moving heavy bundles and sacks often meant carrying loads on shoulders or backs over dusty, uneven paths. This added to the physical toll and extended the hours of work into early evening or even night in some cases. The mental and emotional strain during harvest season was significant as well. Farmers knew that the outcome of their year depended on these weeks of relentless labor. Any mistake, delay, or unforeseen event, like a sudden storm or illness, could lead to disaster. This pressure weighed heavily on their minds, increasing stress and anxiety. Yet there was no option but to carry on. Social and economic pressures intensified during harvest. Tax collectors arrived expecting their share of grain, often the best quality produce. Landowners watched closely to ensure that tenants delivered their dues. Missing deadlines or under-delivering could result in fines, punishment, or loss of land. Farmers faced harsh consequences if they failed to meet these demands, adding urgency to their exhausting workload. Harvest season also brought the risk of injury. Sharp sickles, heavy lifting, and exhaustion contributed to accidents, cuts, or sprains. However, medical care was limited, and injuries often had to be endured while continuing to work. Falling behind was not an option, as others depended on the crop and the family's survival was at stake. The lack of breaks meant that farmers rarely slept enough during harvest time. Rest was squeezed into short periods at night, often in cramped and uncomfortable conditions. This chronic fatigue further reduced strength and endurance, making the endless work even harder. Despite these hardships, harvest time also had moments of communal spirit. Families and neighbors sometimes worked side by side, sharing tools and helping each other. The shared goal of saving the crop fostered a sense of cooperation, even amid competition and stress. Still, these moments of togetherness could not erase the underlying exhaustion and worry. At the end of harvest, when grain was finally stored and the immediate rush ended, farmers faced a bittersweet relief. The season's hard work was done, but the yield's size and quality determined their fate. Success meant enough food to survive the coming year and pay taxes. Failure meant hunger, debt, or worse. The weight of harvest season's non-stop labor was carried throughout the year in memory and consequence. The relentless grind of harvest season was emblematic of the entire farming life in ancient Mesopotamia. Long hours, back-breaking work, little reward, and constant uncertainty. For farmers, these weeks of non-stop toil were a harsh reminder of how precarious and difficult their existence was. No matter how hard they worked, so much depended on forces beyond their control, making every harvest a gamble with their family's future. The demanding nature of harvest season made clear that being a farmer in ancient Mesopotamia was not a choice but a life sentence of labor and struggle. It was a period when the dreams of food and security clashed with the harsh reality of sun, sweat, and exhaustion. The endless work and lack of respite made clear why farming was one of the hardest and least forgiving occupations of the time. In essence, harvest season was a brutal trial by fire. It tested every farmer's strength, endurance, and resilience. It pushed families to their limits physically and emotionally, and it reinforced the unyielding cycle of toil that defined life for farmers in ancient Mesopotamia, leaving no room for rest, no space for leisure, and little hope for relief. In ancient Mesopotamia, debt was a constant and dangerous shadow over the lives of farmers. The economy was largely based on agriculture, and farmers often needed to borrow seed, tools, or food to get through bad seasons or to prepare for planting. But because they lived so close to the edge of survival, even a small failure in the harvest or a delay in payment could spiral into a crushing debt. If a farmer could not pay off what they owed, the consequences were severe, sometimes even tragic. One of the harshest realities was that the farmer or their family members could be forced into slavery. This harsh system worked like a trap. When a farmer failed to produce enough crops due to floods, droughts, pests, or any number of challenges, they might borrow from a wealthier landowner, merchant, or temple official to survive. This debt often came with high interest or strict conditions. Because the farmer's income was unreliable and seasonal, it was very difficult to pay back loans on time, especially if the previous year's harvest had been poor. Failure to repay could lead to dire punishment. One form of punishment was debt slavery. If a farmer could not pay their debts, they, or sometimes their family members, might be sold or handed over as slaves to the creditor. This meant losing all freedom, becoming property, and having to work for the person they owed money to, often in brutal conditions. The idea that someone who had spent their whole life working the land could suddenly be reduced to the status of a slave was a grim reality for many. This system created a cycle of desperation and fear. Farmers lived with the constant worry that one bad season could ruin their family's future forever. The threat of slavery was not hypothetical, it was real and very present. Families might sell children or spouses to pay debts, breaking apart households and communities. This desperate reality left many farmers feeling powerless and trapped. Even if a farmer was not immediately sold into slavery, the stigma and social consequences of debt were severe. Debt could mean loss of land use, further limiting a farmer's ability to provide for their family. It might also lead to harsh treatment by creditors, including fines, physical punishment, or forced labor. The social structure of Mesopotamia did not protect poor farmers. Instead, it reinforced their vulnerability and dependence on those with more power. Debt slavery was particularly brutal because it was often hereditary. If a farmer became a slave, their children might also be born into slavery, ensuring that poverty and servitude were passed down through generations. This lack of social mobility kept families trapped in poverty, unable to escape the harsh realities of agricultural life. The laws of the time, such as those found in the famous Code of Hammurabi, included regulations about debt and slavery, but they did not necessarily protect farmers from losing their freedom. Instead, these laws formalized the system, regulating how debts were collected and how slaves were treated, often in ways that favored the wealthy creditors. While some laws tried to prevent outright abuse, the overall system remained harsh and unforgiving for indebted farmers. The emotional toll on farmers facing the threat of debt slavery was enormous. The anxiety of failing to produce enough food, coupled with the fear of losing their freedom or family members, created a heavy psychological burden. Farmers had to continue working even harder, often under unbearable pressure, just to avoid falling into debt. This fear also affected how farmers interacted with their neighbors and community. Some might try to help each other to avoid debt, but competition for water, land, and resources often made cooperation difficult. Distrust and desperation could easily take hold when survival was at stake, fracturing social bonds and making life even harder. Moreover, the risk of debt and slavery discouraged long-term investment in farming. Farmers who lived in constant fear of losing their land or freedom had little incentive to improve their fields or tools. This lack of investment meant lower productivity and perpetuated the cycle of hardship. In many cases, farmers were forced to accept whatever terms creditors offered, no matter how unfair, because they had no alternatives. This created a power imbalance that favored wealthy landowners and temple officials, who could accumulate more wealth and land by exploiting indebted farmers. Over time, this contributed to growing social inequality. The system also meant that farmers had to borrow not just for survival but to pay taxes imposed by the ruling class. Taxes took a portion of the harvest, leaving farmers with less to feed their families and repay debts. This added financial strain made the threat of debt slavery even more pressing. Debt slavery also affected women and children disproportionately. Women might be sold to work in households or temples, losing their independence and becoming vulnerable to exploitation. Children born into slavery had no chance of escaping the system, growing up in servitude with little hope for a better life. For farmers, the possibility of becoming debt slaves was a dark cloud hanging over every decision. Every seed planted, every field tended, and every harvest gathered was weighed against the risk of failure and the potential loss of freedom. This reality defined much of their existence, shaping their daily lives with fear and uncertainty. The system of debt slavery was not unique to Mesopotamia, but the agricultural dependency and the harsh environment made it especially severe here. Farmers were caught in a cycle of poverty and labor that was difficult to break, with slavery looming as a final punishment for failure. Even though debt slavery was a brutal reality, some farmers tried to resist or escape it. Some might flee their villages, seek protection from temples, or try to negotiate better terms. However, such options were limited and risky. The social and legal systems were stacked against them, making true escape rare. In this way, debt slavery kept many farmers in a state of constant struggle, where the margin between survival and servitude was painfully thin. It was a harsh reminder that, despite their essential role in society, farmers had little control over their fate and could be crushed by forces beyond their control at any time. This aspect of ancient Mesopotamian life shows how being a farmer was not just hard work but also fraught with danger, injustice, and fear. The threat of losing everything to debt slavery was a grim reality that underscored the fragile and unforgiving nature of agricultural life in this early civilization. The constant risk of debt and slavery reinforced the idea that farmers were at the bottom of the social hierarchy, vulnerable to exploitation and with few rights or protections. Their lives were defined by toil and insecurity, rather than freedom or prosperity. In conclusion, the risk of debt slavery was one of the harshest burdens faced by farmers in ancient Mesopotamia. It represented a brutal cycle of poverty and loss, where failure could mean not just hunger but the complete loss of freedom. This system trapped many families in hardship for generations, showing that life as a farmer was often a desperate fight for survival against overwhelming odds. In ancient Mesopotamia, farming was not a solitary or easy endeavor. It was a family affair, and everyone, regardless of age or gender, had to contribute to the relentless labor required to keep the crops alive and the household fed. Farming families had no choice but to depend heavily on their children and spouses to share the demanding workload. From a very young age, children were introduced to the harsh realities of agricultural life, not as a gradual learning experience but as necessary contributors to survival. This meant that children often worked alongside their parents in the fields, helping with planting, weeding, watering, and harvesting. The labor was physically exhausting and unforgiving, yet these young ones had no option to escape it. For many farming families, children were an essential part of the workforce. Their small hands helped gather seeds, pick small fruits, or carry water, while older children might help with plowing or repairing irrigation canals. In times of planting or harvest season, the workload was so overwhelming that every pair of hands counted. The children's contributions were vital not only for the immediate survival of the family, but also for ensuring there was enough surplus to pay taxes or debts. Yet, despite the critical role children played, their work was far from gentle or easy. They were exposed to the same harsh sun, physical strain, and constant risk of injury or illness as their parents. Spouses, usually women, also bore a significant portion of the labor, balancing not only fieldwork but the heavy responsibilities of managing the household. This dual burden meant that women worked from sunrise to sunset, tending the fields with their husbands during peak agricultural seasons and then managing food preparation, childcare, and other domestic tasks. The hard labor didn't stop when the fieldwork ended. Women were responsible for grinding grain by hand, a slow and tiring task necessary to turn harvested crops into edible flour. They also cared for animals, maintained household tools, and preserved food, often in difficult conditions. Their physical endurance was as vital as their husbands', and often their efforts went unrecognized by society. In many cases, the division of labor was strict but grueling. Men handled the most physically demanding tasks like plowing with oxen or digging canals, while women and children took on what were considered lighter yet still exhausting chores. However, lighter was relative. Working the sun-scorched fields or standing for hours grinding grain could be brutal. This meant there was rarely any respite for family members. Even small illnesses or injuries could slow the entire family down, threatening their ability to complete necessary work and jeopardizing the whole year's harvest. The reliance on every family member extended into the management of water resources as well. Maintaining the irrigation systems was vital and constant work that required many hands. Women and children often helped clear canals of silt and debris, a dirty and strenuous task, while men did the heavier digging or construction. Since the irrigation canals were the lifeblood of their crops, this work was urgent and could not be delayed, regardless of how exhausted or sick the family might be. This constant physical labor left little time for rest, play, or education, especially for children. While some may imagine that children in ancient times had carefree lives, for farming families in Mesopotamia, childhood was a time of hard work from dawn to dusk. This early exposure to labor was necessary for survival but meant that many children never experienced the freedoms we associate with youth today. Moreover, the pressure to contribute often led to harsh discipline within families. Parents had to enforce strict work routines, as failure to meet the demands of the farm could mean starvation or punishment from tax collectors and landlords. This created a tense family environment where cooperation was essential but stress was ever present. As the seasons changed, so did the type and intensity of work, but the demand for labor never disappeared. During planting, every able hand was needed to sow seeds quickly to take advantage of limited water. During harvest, the pressure intensified even more because crops had to be gathered fast before rotting or pests destroyed them. Families worked long hours with no breaks, and everyone's role was critical. The loss or illness of even one family member could mean an overwhelming burden on the others. In addition to physical labor, children and spouses were often tasked with guarding the crops and stored grain. Wild animals and thieves posed constant threats, so it was common for family members to take shifts watching over their property, sometimes sacrificing sleep and rest. This protective role added another layer of responsibility and stress to family life. Despite their essential role, women and children had very little say in the decisions about farming or household management. The patriarchal structure of Mesopotamian society meant that men usually controlled land use, negotiations with landlords, and dealings with tax collectors. Women and children had to accept their roles and responsibilities without much opportunity to influence the larger picture, reinforcing the rigid social structure that kept families tied to their roles and limits. The workload was not just seasonal but daily and relentless. Even during the off-season, farmers had to repair tools, mend fences, and prepare for the next planting. This meant that families were always working, without real rest or leisure. The constant demand on every member of the family created an exhausting cycle with little chance for respite or escape. Furthermore, the physical toll of such labor was immense. Chronic aches, injuries, and exhaustion were common. Women often faced additional burdens related to childbirth and childrearing while still maintaining their labor in the fields. Children grew up quickly, their bodies hardened by work rather than nurtured by play or education. Children's education, if it existed at all, was often limited to learning the skills necessary for farming or household duties. Literacy and formal schooling were generally reserved for the elite classes and scribes, so most farming families remained illiterate, further limiting their chances for social advancement. In many families, the roles were so entrenched that even illness or injury was no excuse to stop working. A farmer's family could not afford downtime, and the health of each member directly impacted the entire household's survival. Weakness or sickness was treated as a luxury the family could not afford, pushing many to work through pain or discomfort, often worsening their condition. The emotional and psychological strain of relying so heavily on every family member was also significant. The pressure to contribute, the fear of failure, and the constant danger of losing the harvest or falling into debt created a stressful environment. Despite this, family bonds were crucial for survival, and cooperation was often the only way to endure the harsh conditions. This dependence on children and spouses for hard labor also meant that farming families were vulnerable to population changes. Disease outbreaks, famines, or war could reduce the family workforce, making survival even more precarious. The loss of even one family member could tip the balance from subsistence to starvation or debt. In essence, the farming family in ancient Mesopotamia was a tightly knit unit of labor, where every member was indispensable but also subjected to relentless demands. There was no room for childhood innocence or leisure, no respite for women juggling endless chores, and no escape for men facing the brutal realities of physical toil and economic pressure. This harsh interdependence underscored how difficult and unforgiving life was for the farmers who formed the backbone of Mesopotamian civilization. Laws like Hammurabi's Code were some of the earliest written legal systems in history, and they shaped much of life in ancient Mesopotamia, including, quite heavily, the life of farmers. While the Code of Hammurabi is often praised for introducing the idea that written laws could bring order to society, for the people at the very bottom of the social ladder, especially farmers, it often served as a harsh reminder of how powerless they truly were. These laws didn't just govern behavior, they reached deep into everyday life, dictating punishments for everything from theft and debt to farming accidents and crop failure. And crop failure, unfortunately, wasn't treated as a natural tragedy. It was seen as negligence. It was viewed as the farmer's fault. And the penalties could be brutal. The law made little room for understanding the unpredictable forces that impacted a harvest. It didn't account for surprise floods, sudden droughts, swarms of pests, or broken irrigation canals caused by storms. Instead, if a tenant farmer's field didn't yield what was expected, or if the harvest was smaller than what was needed to pay rent or taxes, the farmer could be accused of mismanaging the land. One clause in the code even states that if a farmer failed to maintain his irrigation canals and it led to crop loss in his own or someone else's field, he had to pay compensation. That sounds fair on the surface, but the reality was far more complicated. These canals required constant digging and repair, and farmers were already stretched thin working the fields from sunup to sundown. If someone else upstream didn't properly manage their section, or if a blockage formed overnight, a farmer downstream could wake up to a flooded or dried-out field. Yet even in those cases, it was the farmer who bore the risk, not the landlord or the state. If crops failed, the debt didn't go away, it only grew. And debt, in ancient Mesopotamia, had its own horrifying consequences. A person who couldn't repay could lose their land or be forced into slavery. Even family members, including wives and children, could be taken to settle a debt. And Hammurabi's code didn't just punish incompetence, it punished bad luck, disguised as incompetence. If a farmer leased land and couldn't produce a crop, he still owed the expected rent. This rent wasn't just in silver or coin, it was in actual grain, a literal portion of the harvest. If the harvest didn't come, the debt remained. And if the farmer argued that it wasn't his fault, that the river didn't behave as expected, or that locusts had destroyed the grain, there was little sympathy in the law. What mattered was the result, not the reason. The fear of punishment hung heavy over every planting season. If a storm damaged the canal and the farmer couldn't repair it in time, if oxen died mid-season and couldn't be replaced, if seed grain didn't sprout properly, each of these could lead not only to hunger but to legal trouble. And legal trouble meant punishment, public shame, or debt slavery. It's hard to overstate the pressure this created. Farming was already uncertain, already backbreaking. But now, every failed crop wasn't just a loss, it was a liability. For tenant farmers, those who worked land that belonged to a noble or a temple, the stakes were even higher. The code enforced contracts between landowners and those who worked their land. If the landowner believed the farmer had not fulfilled his duties, he could bring a legal claim. And the farmer, often poor and illiterate, had few ways to defend himself. Legal representation was limited, if available at all, and the courts were not exactly neutral. Wealth and status played a big role in who was believed and who wasn't. There was even a clause that if a farmer didn't use his field properly and let it lie fallow or waste away, he had to repay the owner in full for the expected crop, again, regardless of the circumstances. If that meant selling off tools, livestock, or eventually members of his household, so be it. The code was clear, obligation to the landlord or state came first. The human toll was secondary. This wasn't a system designed to support farmers, it was designed to extract value from them, even when nature conspired against them. What made these laws especially cruel was the fact that they didn't apply equally. If a noble's field failed, or if a temple's storehouse was low, no harsh penalties were imposed on the elite managers in charge. But a small-time farmer with a sick child or a broken plough, the law fell heavily on him. Justice wasn't blind. It was heavily tilted toward the powerful, and farmers bore the weight of that imbalance every day. And remember, many farmers couldn't even read these laws. Hammurabi's code was famously inscribed on tall stone pillars in public places, but that didn't mean the people could understand them. The vast majority of Mesopotamian farmers were illiterate. They didn't have scribes or scholars to explain the nuances of the legal code to them. All they knew was that if their crops failed, the consequences could be devastating. This fear shaped every part of a farmer's life. It influenced planting choices, how early they started work, how many hours their children had to labor, and how many corners they could or could not cut during a growing season. It created a constant sense of anxiety. Farming is difficult even in the best conditions. But when you add the threat of legal punishment on top of environmental chaos, the burden becomes crushing. And there was no room for second chances. One bad season could mean years of debt. Two could mean total ruin. Some farmers would take out loans from wealthier landowners to get through a tough year, only to find themselves stuck in a cycle of borrowing and repaying that they could never escape. They couldn't declare bankruptcy. There was no safety net. Just the cold letters of Hammurabi's code and the sharp edge of its enforcement. It's worth noting that these laws weren't just theoretical, they were enforced. Legal records from the time show disputes over land use, irrigation maintenance, and harvest yields. Farmers were sued, fined, and penalized. These weren't rare cases, they were a regular part of life. The legal system didn't just sit in the background. It actively shaped the risks of farming and increased the chances that an unlucky farmer could lose everything. And if someone tried to flee to escape punishment, that too was covered under the law. There were rules for what happened to runaway farmers, or those who abandoned land without paying what they owed. In many cases, officials were tasked with bringing them back, and additional penalties were added to the original debt. There was no escape from the system, not geographically, and certainly not legally. The weight of the law, combined with the unpredictability of nature, turned every farming season into a gamble with life-altering stakes. Success meant just barely keeping your head above water. Failure could mean slavery. And no matter how hard the farmer worked, how loyal or honest they were, the system didn't bend. It didn't forgive. The Code of Hammurabi may have brought order to a kingdom, but to the farmer hunched over his crops, covered in sweat and dirt, it often felt more like a trap. When crops failed in ancient Mesopotamia, the consequences were often swift and brutal. Food didn't just become scarce, it disappeared. Most farming families didn't have large reserves set aside for emergencies. They couldn't walk into a market and purchase supplies for months at a time. Their grain came from their own soil, their own hands, and their own harvest. If the fields didn't produce, there was nothing to eat. And unlike in modern times, there were no food banks, no government aid programs, and no organized charity systems. When the granaries were empty, they were truly empty. Hunger was not just uncomfortable, it was deadly. The dependency on a single growing season meant that timing was everything. Crops like barley and wheat had to be planted, maintained, and harvested at specific points in the year. If a river flooded too long or too late, if pests arrived during the sprouting phase, if a sudden drought withered the plants before they matured, there wasn't a second chance. The window was closed. This wasn't just a personal failure, it became a community crisis. When one farmer's crop failed, others might still have food. But when many fields failed in the same season, panic set in. People began to ration, to go hungry on purpose just to make supplies last longer, hoping that somehow they'd find a way to survive until the next planting season. It wasn't just the farmers who suffered, either. Their crops fed entire villages, cities, even palaces. When rural harvests failed, the effects rippled into urban areas. Markets dried up. Prices skyrocketed. People in the cities who had nothing to do with farming suddenly couldn't afford to buy bread. And the farmers, those already living on the edge, had nothing to sell and nothing to eat. It created a feedback loop of misery. A failed harvest didn't just ruin a year. It ruined lives. Hunger in ancient Mesopotamia wasn't a distant fear. It was a familiar shadow. People knew what it felt like for their stomachs to shrink day by day. Children would grow weak and stop playing. The elderly would quietly slip away, their bodies unable to handle the long days without nourishment. There are written records from ancient times that describe periods of famine with chilling detail, stories of people grinding acacia bark or eating clay just to feel full. They scavenged for anything remotely edible. Roots, insects, even livestock dung was sometimes dried and mixed with water in desperate attempts to stretch what little grain remained. For those who had a little extra grain stored, the temptation to hoard it became overwhelming. Families would seal up what remained of their stores and hide it, not just from neighbors, but from tax collectors or soldiers who might come demanding a portion. Trust frayed during famines. People who had known each other for years became suspicious, even hostile. Theft increased. If a family had food and another didn't, it could lead to violence. A sack of barley became more valuable than silver, more precious than cloth or livestock. It became the difference between life and death. Malnutrition spread like wildfire in times of famine. The human body, already weakened by constant labor and poor living conditions, began to shut down. Immunity dropped. People became sick from things they might have otherwise survived. Diseases like dysentery or respiratory infections, which were already common, became even deadlier. Wounds took longer to heal. Simple fevers became fatal. And with so many already living at the brink, entire communities could be wiped out in a matter of weeks. Sometimes, in the most desperate moments, people were forced to sell what little they had left, tools, animals, even land, to buy a few days' worth of food. But when everything was gone, they were faced with impossible choices. Historical records describe times when families sold their children into servitude just to survive another month. It wasn't out of cruelty, it was out of hope that the child might eat, might live, might find a home with more resources. And sometimes even that wasn't enough. When multiple bad harvests came back to back, famine turned into societal collapse. Trade routes broke down. Temples, which were supposed to store surplus grain for emergencies, either ran out or refused to give it away without exacting something in return: labor, land, or loyalty. The temples were part of the power structure, and in times of crisis, they didn't always act benevolently. In fact, some scholars believe that certain famines were made worse by those in control hoarding supplies to maintain their own power. Food was not just a survival tool, it became a weapon. The memory of famines lingered. Even after the rains returned and new crops began to grow, the trauma stuck with people. Children who had watched siblings waste away became hyper-vigilant about storing food. Families built their entire schedules around the seasons, praying to the gods for a stable harvest. But no prayer could guarantee safety. In Mesopotamia, the gods were unpredictable, just like the rivers and the weather. Sometimes offerings worked. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes, despite everything, the sky stayed dry and the grain stayed small, and the cycle of hunger began again. It's important to understand that the fear of hunger wasn't just a background anxiety. It was a daily motivator. It was why farmers worked such long hours, why children were put to work so young, why every drop of water was precious, and every sack of grain guarded like treasure. Hunger shaped relationships, shaped rituals, shaped laws. Even holidays were often centered around food, celebrating its abundance or pleading for its return. And when it was gone, there was no comfort, no distraction, no escape. Just the gnawing pain in the belly and the long, quiet wait for rain. Even in death, the hunger left its mark. Skeletons from archaeological digs show signs of prolonged malnutrition, stunted growth, brittle bones, missing teeth. Generations grew up smaller and weaker after famines. And yet, they kept farming. What choice did they have? The land was all they knew. The tools were all they had. The work, the grind, the sun, it was all part of the same terrible cycle. A life of toil for a harvest that might vanish in a single season. And as cruel as it was, they hoped. They hoped that next year would be better. That the rains would come at the right time. That no flood would drown the seedlings. That no locusts would arrive in the night. That somehow, against all odds, the earth would be kind. But Mesopotamia was rarely kind. It demanded everything. And sometimes, even that wasn't enough to fill a bowl. At night, the silence across the Mesopotamian fields could be misleading. While the sky darkened and families gathered around their small, flickering lamps, the land itself remained restless. Out in the distance, beyond the reach of human eyes, wild animals stirred. These weren't the imagined beasts of myth or superstition. These were real, living threats that crept under the cover of night, sniffing out the sweet scent of ripening crops. Jackals, wild pigs, gazelles, and other animals roamed the fields with one goal: to eat. And the soft barley and young wheat shoots provided an irresistible banquet. After all the hard work of planting, tending, and praying for growth, Farmers had to face the reality that their fragile harvest could be chewed down in a single night by the hungry teeth of nature. It wasn't as if farmers could take shifts patrolling their fields all night. They were already exhausted from sunrise to sunset labor. By nightfall, their bodies ached and their eyes drooped. Even if they wanted to stand guard, they had little light to work with, just oil lamps or torches, which didn't cover much ground. So instead, many built makeshift fences around their plots, weaving together dried reeds or using stacks of stones, hoping these barriers would be enough to keep the wild animals out. But they weren't. A determined boar or pack of jackals could slip through or knock them over easily. These nighttime raids could undo days, even weeks, of careful effort. What made it worse was the unpredictability. There were no guarantees. A field could be safe for weeks, and then one night, everything would change. The sound of rustling might wake a farmer too late, only for them to stumble outside and find trampled stalks, half-eaten grain heads, and paw prints in the damp soil. Sometimes, the damage wasn't even about eating. It was the careless crushing of tender shoots under hooves or paws as animals passed through. A single night's intrusion could ruin an entire row, leaving bare patches that couldn't be replanted until the next season. In response, some farmers tried to construct scarecrows or hang noisy objects like shells or bits of metal in hopes of frightening away intruders. But wild animals in ancient Mesopotamia weren't easily fooled. They were desperate, too. They were competing for survival in a landscape where resources were scarce, and cultivated crops were the easiest, richest source of food. A few strange noises or a flickering light wasn't always enough to keep them at bay. In many cases, it just meant the animals waited a bit longer, returning in the dead of night when even the dogs had stopped barking. Dogs, by the way, were sometimes used as a form of protection. Some farmers kept them not as pets, but as night guards. These animals, trained to bark or chase intruders, offered a slim sense of security. But dogs also needed food, and when food was scarce, they grew weak and less reliable. A starving dog was less likely to chase off a pack of jackals. And sometimes, if desperate enough, even domesticated animals turned on the stored grain or scavenged from the fields themselves. Hunger didn't recognize loyalty. There were also larger predators to consider, depending on the region and era. Lions, though less common in heavily settled areas, still existed in parts of ancient Mesopotamia, especially near riverbanks and thick brush. A lion wasn't likely to come for the crops, but it could come for livestock, goats, sheep, oxen tethered near the edge of a field. And in trying to protect one thing, the farmer might lose another. Some nights, the line between predator and prey shifted in terrifying ways. There are records of shepherds disappearing during night watches, their bodies never found, only their empty sandals left behind. In addition to mammals, there were also insects that moved under the cover of darkness. Though smaller and less dramatic than boars or jackals, swarms of beetles or locusts could chew through fields with terrifying efficiency. These weren't nightly visitors, but when they came, they could leave behind a field that looked like it had been burnt. The damage done by such infestations, often occurring while the farmer slept, could be as bad as a flood or a drought. The emotional toll was just as real as the physical loss. Imagine lying awake in a small mud brick house, listening to distant howls, rustling reeds, or the soft crunch of hooves on dry soil, knowing you might be hearing your only food for the season being destroyed. Imagine stepping out the next morning and seeing your dreams of survival reduced to shredded stalks and muddy footprints. There was no insurance, no refund, no second chance. Just despair. In response to these threats, some farmers tried to rotate their planting or space crops across several fields. That way, if one was damaged, another might be spared. But this wasn't always possible. Land was limited. Time was limited. Labor was limited. A small family could only tend so many plots. Dividing their attention might protect against complete loss, but it also guaranteed less yield in each place. It was a gamble either way, and often a losing one. The community, when it existed, sometimes helped in shared protection. Neighbors would warn each other of recent sightings, or join forces to build sturdier barriers. But even this had limits. Everyone was tired. Everyone had their own land to defend. And when animals destroyed one person's crop, the others might silently feel relief. It wasn't theirs this time. The shared pain didn't always lead to shared action. More often, It led to isolation, suspicion, and quiet resignation. These challenges weren't occasional, they were expected. Living beside nature meant living under constant threat. Farmers didn't just fight the soil and the sky. They fought the wildlife. They fought for their fields, every single day, and every single night. Some even slept outside near their crops during critical periods, wrapping themselves in blankets and hoping their presence would be enough to deter a hungry creature. It rarely was. What's most tragic is that these nightly battles were largely invisible to the world beyond. The cities benefited from the food, the temples collected their grain, and the kings issued orders. But none of them saw the fox in the wheat, or the boar in the barley, or the jackals slinking through the shadows. None of them woke to the sound of chewing and the bitter realization that the harvest had vanished again. The farmers faced that alone. And yet, they kept going. Because there was no other way. No retreat. No city to run to. No trade to fall back on. Their lives were tied to the land, even when the land turned against them. They endured the night, again and again, praying that maybe, just maybe, tomorrow's sun would rise on a field still standing. Most farmers in ancient Mesopotamia could not read or write, yet they were still required to pay taxes just like any wealthy merchant or literate scribe. This was one of the many cruel ironies of their lives. Imagine being unable to read the laws that governed your work, unable to understand the documents you were expected to comply with, and yet still held accountable for every grain owed, every measure counted, every portion of the harvest taken. These farmers worked in dirt and sweat, rising with the sun and collapsing with the dark, but when tax season came, often just after harvest, they had to face officials who could tally up obligations with styluses and clay tablets, a language completely foreign to those who did the growing. These taxes weren't optional. Even if you didn't fully understand what you were being taxed on or how much you were supposed to give, the tax collectors knew. They arrived with records, expectations, and in many cases, armed enforcers. The scribes in the city centers kept detailed accounts on clay tablets, using cuneiform writing to document what each farm owed. It didn't matter that the farmer couldn't read the records. It didn't matter that there might have been a mistake. There was no arguing with a tablet. No second opinion. No appeals process. The system was designed by and for the literate elite. Everyone else, especially the farmers, had to simply nod, give what was asked, and pray they weren't being cheated. And they often were. Because without the ability to read or write, a farmer had no way of proving anything. No way to verify what portion of their field was being taxed, or whether they had already paid their due. If a tax collector claimed the farmer owed more, that was the end of it. Disputes were rare and dangerous. You couldn't exactly walk into a city council chamber and demand justice if you couldn't read your own name. And in many cases, these farmers didn't even have a personal name that was recorded. Just a number, a location, a piece of land. They were anonymous to the system that ruled their lives. Some families tried to pass on verbal knowledge from generation to generation to keep track of taxes. They would memorize amounts, dates, seasons, and events like floods or droughts to argue their case when collectors came. But memory fades, and tax collectors didn't care much for oral arguments. They had their tablets. They had their numbers. And if your barn wasn't full enough, or your store of grain didn't satisfy their quota, they could take tools, animals, even children as payment. That's how unforgiving the system was. This lack of literacy wasn't a personal failing, it was a structural barrier. The elite class, which included priests, nobles, scribes, and officials, had access to formal education. They studied in temples and schools, learning the art of writing, record-keeping, mathematics, and law. Farmers, on the other hand, had no time or resources to send their children to such places. From an early age, children were needed in the fields. Every pair of hands mattered. Teaching a child how to write meant pulling them away from watering canals, planting seeds, or grinding grain. It was a luxury most could never afford. And even if a farming family had the ambition or hope to educate a child, social mobility was nearly non-existent. Being able to write didn't necessarily mean you could leave the land. The upper class protected their status carefully. Scribes often inherited their roles, just like farmers did. To break into that world required patronage, wealth, and a degree of luck that rarely landed in a farmer's lap. So literacy remained a closed gate, and the key to understanding one's obligations stayed firmly in the hands of the ruling class. Because farmers couldn't read, they also had no access to the laws that governed them. Hammurabi's code, for instance, was etched into large stone stelae and placed in public areas, but they might as well have been blank to the average farmer. These legal texts determined penalties for crop failures, irrigation mistakes, and property damage. But since the farmers couldn't read them, they only learned about the law after they had supposedly broken it. By the time they were being punished, fined, or threatened with slavery, it was too late to learn the rules. It created a world where ignorance was not just common, it was weaponized against them. This same illiteracy extended to the marketplace. When farmers did have extra grain or goods to sell, they were at the mercy of literate traders who recorded transactions and set prices. The farmer might weigh out sacks of barley or bundles of flax, but the merchant would write down the value and terms. Again, there was no verifying whether the records matched what had actually been agreed upon. And if a dispute arose later, the merchant's written account would be taken as truth. It created a power imbalance that was impossible to escape. Some temples did offer limited forms of help to farming communities, especially if the land they worked on belonged to the temple itself. Priests and temple scribes might assist in documenting yields or explaining rules, but this help came at a cost. Temples expected loyalty, labor, offerings, and often, a portion of the harvest too. So even where there was assistance, it reinforced the same hierarchical systems that kept farmers at the bottom of society. It was a loop they couldn't break. Despite all this, the government still expected them to comply. Their inability to read or write didn't reduce their taxes. It didn't grant them leniency. They were expected to give what was owed and do it on time. Failure to do so led to harsh consequences. Land could be taken, tools confiscated, and families punished. In the worst cases, entire lineages could be wiped out financially for a debt they barely understood. And even then, the records would say the tax was unpaid, the quota unmet, the debt unresolved, all in writing the farmer would never comprehend. What's staggering is how much of ancient Mesopotamian society rested on the shoulders of these illiterate workers. They fed the cities. They produced the surplus that made trade possible. They harvested the barley that fed armies, the flax that clothed officials, the dates and onions and lentils that filled the temple kitchens. And yet, they remained cut off from the very language of power that defined their lives. While others wrote the history, signed the decrees, and etched their names into the record books, the farmer's voice was left out. Their knowledge was physical, sensory, seasonal. They knew the signs of a coming flood, the texture of healthy soil, the smell of rot, the weight of grain. They were experts in a kind of wisdom that never got written down, but was just as vital to survival. And still, in the eyes of the literate world, they were considered lesser. Poor, uneducated, replaceable. So they labored on, year after year, handing over a share of their hard-earned harvest to a system that didn't see them as equals, didn't teach them the rules, and didn't care whether they understood. They were expected to give, and give, and give, without ever truly knowing why or how. And they did, because they had no other choice. Water was life in ancient Mesopotamia, and yet, the very thing that kept farms alive was also the source of some of the bitterest conflicts. When the summer heat baked the land and the rivers receded just enough to make every drop of water feel more precious than gold, it wasn't uncommon for other farmers, neighbors, even friends, to sneakily divert water from shared irrigation channels. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience. For the farmer who lost that water, it could mean the difference between a decent crop and a failed harvest, between having enough to eat and going hungry, between survival and ruin. The irrigation systems that snaked across the Mesopotamian plains were complex and essential. Canals, ditches, and gates guided river water to farmlands that otherwise would have remained parched. These systems didn't just happen on their own. Farmers built them with their own hands, shoveling mud, piling stones, clearing weeds, and constantly patching breaches. It took work, intense, muddy, exhausting work. And yet, no matter how carefully a farmer maintained his section, he couldn't control what someone upstream might decide to do in the dead of night or during a moment of opportunity. When a farmer upstream wanted more water, he might quietly widen his canal or block part of the main channel, slowing or redirecting the flow. Sometimes it was temporary, just enough to flood his own field. But sometimes it was sabotage in all but name. Maybe the upstream farmer had suffered a bad season, or maybe he was simply greedy. Either way, once the water was gone, the downstream farmer was left staring at drying soil and wilting crops, helpless to do anything about it. That's the thing about irrigation theft. You usually didn't know it had happened until the damage was already done. And confronting the thief wasn't so simple. Even if you suspected someone, accusing another farmer, especially a more powerful or better connected one, could lead to trouble. You might face retaliation, or worse, end up being blamed yourself. In a society where disputes were settled by local officials who often favored the wealthy or influential, a poor farmer's complaint could easily be dismissed. And remember, most farmers couldn't read or write, so even if they tried to take their grievance to a scribe or a temple, they lacked the tools to make a strong case. This kind of water theft bred mistrust among farming communities. It sowed quiet resentment between neighbors who depended on one another in other parts of life. These were people who helped each other repair dikes or share tools during planting season. Yet when the water started to dry up, those same people might be the ones stealing in the night. That tension hung heavy in the air, especially during the hottest, driest parts of the year. A farmer might look across the fields and wonder whether his neighbor's thriving crops had come at his own expense. And the impact was more than emotional. Without enough water, crops could die off quickly. The heat and wind of the Mesopotamian summer were brutal, and without regular irrigation, plants didn't stand a chance. Even if the farmer managed to save a portion of his field, the yield would be lower, which meant he'd have less to eat, less to sell, and less to pay in taxes. And of course, taxes weren't adjusted just because your neighbor drained your water. The tax collectors didn't care about excuses. If the farmer's barn wasn't full, that was his problem, not the state's. Sometimes, disputes over water boiled over into violence. Farmers might block each other's canals out of revenge or desperation. Whole communities could end up feuding, creating long-standing rivalries that lasted generations. In some cases, officials had to step in to mediate, but even that often ended up favoring whoever had more wealth or social connections. Poor farmers had little recourse. They could try to dig new channels, backbreaking work, or pray for rain, which wasn't dependable in the Mesopotamian climate. It also didn't help that irrigation systems weren't standardized. Some areas had better infrastructure than others. If your land was located far from the main canal or if you were stuck at the tail end of a shared system, you were always at a disadvantage. You got what was left, if anything at all. And if someone upstream took too much, there might be nothing left by the time the water reached you. That wasn't an accident of design. The people with more land, more animals, and more connections often secured the best water access. Everyone else had to fight for scraps. What's worse, even if you caught someone stealing water, proving it was difficult. Water flowed naturally. It could be redirected or dammed without leaving behind clear evidence. And farmers didn't have surveillance, records, or enforcement. Most of the time, they had only their eyes and their instincts. They might notice a neighbor's field looking a little too green, or find a gate that had been moved, or see new channels that weren't there last week. But unless someone confessed or was caught in the act, there was little they could do. For many, this meant living with a constant sense of vulnerability. No matter how hard they worked, how carefully they managed their fields, or how well they maintained their canals, everything could be undone by another's selfish decision. And that helplessness, that lack of control, made the grind of farming even more demoralizing. It turned nature into an enemy not just in the form of floods and droughts, but also in the way people manipulated it to hurt one another. The shared use of irrigation created an uneasy dependency. Everyone needed the water. Everyone needed each other to follow the unspoken rules. But there were no real protections. No fair system to guarantee access. And so the very lifeblood of agriculture became a point of bitter conflict, suspicion, and stress. It was a constant reminder that even in the harshest environments, people weren't just struggling against nature, they were struggling against each other, too. The farmers of ancient Mesopotamia, despite being the backbone of the society and the ones who provided food for everyone, had virtually no political power or control over the decisions that shaped their lives. This lack of influence left them at the mercy of higher powers, kings, priests, and the wealthy elite, who often viewed farmers as little more than tools for their own benefit. These rulers, who made the laws and set the taxes, rarely considered the hardships faced by farmers when making decisions. Instead, the choices that directly impacted the lives of the farmers were often made without their input, leading to a deep sense of powerlessness and frustration. The ancient Mesopotamian government was hierarchical, with kings, priests, and nobles at the top, and farmers at the bottom. These farmers had no voice in the decisions that affected their daily lives. The kings and their appointed officials were the ones who decided the laws, imposed taxes, and made decisions about land distribution. But none of these decisions were made with the concerns of the farmers in mind. These rulers often acted in their own best interests, using the farmers as a resource to fund wars, build monuments, and support the lavish lifestyles of the elite. Even though farmers worked tirelessly to produce the food that sustained the kingdom, their lives were controlled by forces far beyond their reach. Farmers had little to no representation in the political structure. They couldn't vote on matters of importance, and they had no say in the laws that governed their land and their labor. The political system was designed to keep them in their place, with no opportunity to rise in status or change their situation. There were no elected officials who could advocate on behalf of farmers, no public forums for discussion, and no mechanisms to allow them to express their grievances. If a farmer had a complaint, their only recourse was to appeal to local officials or the king, but these appeals were often ignored or dismissed unless they came from someone with wealth or influence. Moreover, even the system of justice wasn't impartial. Laws, like those codified in the famous Code of Hammurabi, were harsh, and punishment for breaking the law could be severe. But these laws weren't always applied equally. The wealthy and powerful could afford to manipulate the legal system, bribing officials or using their influence to escape punishment. Meanwhile, poor farmers were left to bear the full weight of the law. If they broke a law, intentionally or unintentionally, the punishment could be swift and brutal. For farmers, even the slightest infraction could lead to financial ruin, imprisonment, or worse. It was clear that the political system wasn't designed to protect them but rather to maintain the status quo, which kept the elites in power and the farmers in their place. In addition to having no say in the laws that governed their lives, farmers also had no control over the land they worked. The land belonged to the king, and the farmers were essentially tenants who worked the land in exchange for the right to live on it. While they were allowed to keep the crops they grew, a significant portion of their harvest was taken by the king or other officials as tax. This constant taking of their produce meant that farmers had little to show for their labor. The fruits of their hard work were often siphoned off by the state or the wealthy landowners who controlled the land. Farmers' lack of political power also extended to their lack of control over their own labor. They were often forced to work on projects that had nothing to do with farming, such as building temples or palaces, or serving in the military. These forced labor projects, known as corvée labor, were a burden that took time away from their crops and their families. Farmers were often required to give a portion of their time to these projects, with little regard for the impact on their own well-being. These tasks were often grueling and physically demanding, and they were imposed by those in power with no consideration for the hardship it caused the farmers. The farmers' lack of control over their labor and resources extended to their economic lives as well. They had no way to protect themselves from market fluctuations or the whims of the elite. If the price of grain dropped or if there was an oversupply, farmers could find themselves in debt, unable to sell their crops at a fair price. The government's taxes, which were based on the harvest, didn't take into account how much a farmer had earned or whether their crops had been damaged by floods, droughts, or pests. If the harvest was poor, the farmer still had to pay the same amount in taxes, which could push them into debt or even slavery. In such a system, the farmers had no means to improve their situation or move up the social ladder. They were born into their roles and died in them, stuck in a cycle of poverty and hardship. The social hierarchy was rigid, with little opportunity for mobility. Even if a farmer worked hard and produced a bountiful crop, they were unlikely to be able to afford the bribes, gifts, or connections needed to move up in society. The ruling class maintained strict control over the economy, the land, and the laws, ensuring that farmers remained at the bottom. This lack of political power and control left farmers feeling isolated and vulnerable. They were at the mercy of those who held power, and they had few options for improving their lives. They couldn't influence the decisions that affected them, and they had no way to change the system that kept them oppressed. Their only hope was that the gods would be kind to them, that the rivers would flood in the right way, and that their crops would grow. But even this hope was limited, as the gods, like the kings, were often more concerned with the needs of the elite than with the well-being of the farmers. In conclusion, the political system of ancient Mesopotamia kept farmers in a perpetual state of subjugation. They had no voice, no control, and no means of improving their lot in life. Their labor was exploited, their resources were taken by the state, and they had no recourse to challenge the decisions that affected them. In many ways, their lives were controlled by the whims of the elite, and the system was designed to keep them in their place, ensuring that they remained at the bottom of the social ladder for their entire lives. The farmers may have worked the land and produced the food that fed the kingdom, but they had no power to shape their own destiny. They were caught in a cycle of poverty and labor, with little hope of escape. Even when sick or injured, farmers had to keep working or risk starving. There was no such thing as a day off in ancient Mesopotamia, not for a fever, not for a broken bone, not even for exhaustion so deep it made standing up a struggle. Farmers didn't have the luxury of resting to heal. Their survival depended entirely on their ability to keep moving, keep working, and keep coaxing food out of the ground. The crops didn't pause because someone twisted their ankle or came down with a cough. The animals didn't wait patiently for their food. The fields didn't stop needing water just because the farmer couldn't lift the shovel that day. Every hour missed meant a task undone, and every task undone could lead to hunger weeks or months down the line. It was a cruel rhythm that left no room for weakness. There was no healthcare system to speak of, no doctors in the village ready to treat a wounded back or help with a lung infection. If you were lucky, someone in your family might know a few herbs or tricks passed down through generations, but even those remedies were limited. The Mesopotamian understanding of medicine was a blend of superstition and crude trial and error. Many ailments were believed to be punishments from the gods, and so treatment might involve prayers or rituals rather than actual healing. If a farmer got a cut on their hand while working and it got infected, there was a real chance that something as small as that could turn deadly. Even a fever could become a death sentence in a world without antibiotics, and still, the work could not stop. For many farmers, especially the older ones, every morning began with aches and pain. Years of hard labor under the harsh sun wore down their bodies early. Knees gave out, backs hunched, fingers curled with stiffness, and yet they kept going. Children might help as soon as they were old enough to carry a bucket, but even with the support of family, the burden fell mostly on the heads of the household. Missing even one day of planting or irrigation could mean a poor harvest. Missing a week could mean no harvest at all. So, people pushed themselves beyond what any person should be expected to endure, all because the alternative was worse, starving in the off-season or failing to pay the taxes that could send them or their children into slavery. Injury wasn't just painful, it was dangerous in a deeper, systemic way. If a farmer couldn't work, they couldn't fulfill their obligations to the landowner or the king. In Mesopotamia, land was leased, not owned by the person farming it, and missing your quota of crops or failing to pay your dues came with stiff consequences. You could lose the right to farm that land, and without land, you couldn't grow food. That meant you couldn't eat. That meant you couldn't live. Injury wasn't just a threat to your health, it was a threat to your entire way of life. If you didn't have family to take up the work, there was no safety net. People didn't retire from farming. They worked until their body gave out, and if it gave out too soon, that was it. The communal nature of farming in Mesopotamia could sometimes offer small relief, but even that came with limitations. Neighbors were often just as overworked and desperate as you were. If they helped you, they were falling behind on their own work. Sometimes, in tight-knit communities, people would pitch in for someone who had gotten badly hurt or was near death, but that wasn't guaranteed, and even then, there was resentment. Every extra day someone spent helping a sick neighbor was a day of risk added to their own harvest. And resentment could build quietly. Later, when the harvest came in, those favors might be expected to be repaid, not with words, but with grain, labor, or livestock. Help was never really free, even if it looked like kindness at the time. One of the worst parts was that there was no formal recognition of disability or injury. There was no such thing as being excused from duties because of pain or illness. The body breaking down didn't mean the world slowed down to match it. If a farmer lost a limb in an accident, or worse, lost their sight, they didn't get a pension or a protected role in society. They simply became a burden to their families. Many of these injured individuals ended up begging, or relying on their children to take over full responsibility much earlier than they otherwise would have. In some households, children as young as 5 or 6 were thrust into full days of labor just to compensate for a parent who could no longer work. The emotional toll of this kind of life was severe, though rarely acknowledged. To wake up each day knowing that your body was failing but the earth didn't care, that the sun would rise and expect you in the field no matter how broken you felt, that was a crushing kind of hopelessness. You couldn't call in sick. You couldn't ask for a lighter day. There was no such thing as healing in comfort. If your leg swelled up and you couldn't walk, you dragged yourself. If your lungs burned with fever, you still bent over and hoed the field. Every breath was a debt you had to repay in sweat. This unrelenting pressure also led to dangerous choices. Many farmers, terrified of falling behind, would return to work too soon after injury. A pulled muscle wasn't given the time to heal. A broken toe was just wrapped in rags and shoved back into a sandal. A slash across the arm was tied tight and ignored. And each time this happened, the risk of long-term damage increased. Injuries compounded over time, making it even harder to function, even harder to rest, and even harder to survive. The body became a patchwork of worn-out joints, strained muscles, and fading strength, held together by sheer necessity and the will to keep going. When famine threatened or war was looming, the pressure only got worse. Everyone worked harder, including the sick. There was no prioritization of who was capable. If you could stand, you worked. If you couldn't stand, you crawled. The fear of starvation was greater than the pain. The fear of losing the farm was worse than the fever. Pain became background noise in the life of a Mesopotamian farmer. It was always there, always pressing down, and yet they had to move forward as if it didn't exist. And it wasn't just physical injuries that farmers endured. Mental stress, though less visible, was just as real. The constant fear of failing to produce enough food, the anxiety over sudden floods, the dread of tax collectors showing up unannounced, all of it piled on. And without rest or recovery, without any institutional or social support, this stress slowly eroded the spirit. Despair was common, but it had to be swallowed. There was no space to cry, no time to grieve, no moment to say, "I need help." A farmer's life was one long test of endurance, with no medals for making it through. Even the smallest misstep while working through pain could bring catastrophe. Tripping while carrying water, stumbling while leading an ox, losing grip on a heavy tool, all could result in worse injury. And still, no pause was possible. Many simply didn't speak of their wounds. They buried the pain, kept quiet, and worked in silence. Because talking about the hurt didn't make the field plow itself. It didn't make the wheat grow any faster. It didn't make the taxman go away. And at night, when the work was done, there was no warm bed or soft mat to lie on. There was no bath to soak the aches away. Just the same hard floor, the same stale air, and the knowledge that tomorrow would bring the same burdens again. No one cared if your back was broken or if your hands were blistered raw. As long as you could walk, you were expected to work. And when you couldn't walk anymore, you were expected to crawl. Because in ancient Mesopotamia, rest wasn't a right, it was a luxury that only the rich could afford. This video is for educational or entertainment purposes only, and information provided in the video may be incorrect. If you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing to the channel and like the video. Good night.